Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we bring you the latest from the frontiers of scientific research on new evidences for the Christian faith, the God of the Bible, the reliability of the Bible. We're also going to be looking at answers to the most frequently asked questions we receive at Reasons to Believe. Well, last time we talked about the Mars Pathfinder mission and the question of the possibility of life on Mars. And there's a little bit on there we wanted to clean up before we leave that subject and move on to other things. And I don't know about you, Mark, but as I was watching television and especially talk radio, there were a few NASA representatives.
There's more than a few.
More than a few?
Yeah. Well, I've seen several things, and I'll get to ask you a question because, if you watch the news media, the anchor people and the like, you see one level of excitement about it. And then you see the internet folks, and they're excited about it. But then you actually see the NASA people, and there's enough of them who are very positive and confident about finding life in outer space, particularly on Mars, but somewhere else perhaps. Where do you think all this confidence is coming from, Hugh?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I was really quite shocked to hear NASA representatives saying that it's a guarantee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, we got water, we got chemicals, it's going to be there. We will find it. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it. And I'm saying, well, gee, they haven't even made life in the lab yet. And
yeah.
They think they can find this in an environment like Mars or some other place in the solar system. But there's a reason for that confidence that I don't think has been publicly expressed yet. And this goes back to just a few months where they were doing some research on the Murchison meteorite. Now, the Murchison meteorite is the largest chondrite meteorite that's been discovered.
Chondrite meaning?
Meaning that it has a lot of carbonaceous material in it.
Okay.
And this thing is, several feet across. It's quite a big chunk of stuff from outer space.
Okay.
But it's unrelated to any planet. It's not like this ALH 84001 where
the
we
Martian
know it came
meteorite.
from Mars.
Right.
This is just something that's been floating around the solar system, orbiting the solar system for the past 4.5 billion years. But they discovered that the amino acids, and by the way, most amino acids have nothing to do with biology. There's over 100 amino acids that we see in the natural realm, and 20 of which are significant for biological processes. And
we make proteins and the like. I mean,
right,
yeah.
DNA, RNA.
Right.
And because this Murchison meteorite has a lot of carbonaceous material in it, it's quite well supplied with these amino acids. Now, what they did is they selected 4 amino acids that they knew did not factor into biology. So they felt there would be no problem with contamination there. And they discovered in these 4 amino acids a very slight excess towards left-handedness. And this generated a lot of excitement because with life here on Earth, all the amino acids are left-handed. Now, in the real world, you've got 50% of your amino acids with a right-handed configuration and 50% with a left-handed configuration.
But only the left-handed ones can actually produce...
Only left-handed ones do we see in organisms. And
Okay.
only in organisms, living organisms, have we seen this excess from
Okay.
a 50-50 mixture
Okay.
to where it's 100% left, 0% right.
Okay.
And the Murchison meteorite, they were finding between a 2 to 9% favoritism towards left-handedness.
Okay.
And this is the first time that this has ever been found outside of an organic system.
Okay.
It's never been found before. It's always been a 50-50 mixture.
Right.
And this was showing a very slight favoritism. Now, 2 to 9% isn't that impressive. I mean, get a small enough sample.
Yes, error bars are within
yeah,
3
exactly.
to 9% on a lot of these things, aren't they?
Although in this case, they think they got a big enough sample that seems to be a little bit ahead of what you'd expect by normal random scattering and errors. And the question is, how did it get that excess?
Okay.
Well, the speculation is because it had some contact with life from beyond our
okay.
planet Earth.
And who is there a particular person or group of people that are advocating this particular view, or is it just...
Yes, there are. I mean, it's a significant group of people that are advocating this. And something that's not yet published, but is soon to be published, is that one astronomer thinks that he may even be seeing some microfossils in the Murchison meteorite.
Okay.
Nothing spectacular.
Right.
Again, kind of like ALH 84001, simple, small structures. And in this case, it's not even backed by any strong chemical evidence.
Okay.
We know carbon's there, but the kind of things you'd expect, and I mean, that hasn't been found yet.
Okay.
So highly speculative. And I think the big unanswered question is, why would Murchison ever have life? I mean,
especially if it's just been roaming around in space.
it's this little small thing running around the solar system. Well, speculation is maybe it's not just running around the solar system. It might have been something from some other star that got transported here and captured by the solar system.
Okay.
But in that case, why would it even have the remains of life? And in the last episode, we were making the point that you're not going to get panspermia moving over interstellar spaces.
Well, that's something we have talked about in a previous episode. Can you recast for us and our viewers what panspermia means and what the mechanism is that they're proposing?
Well, panspermia means a transport of life or life's remains so that you can seed some other stellar system.
Okay, and that's the favorite hypothesis now to explain how life may have gotten to Mars, from Mars to Earth.
Right.
Something like that, okay.
The idea that there is some more ideal site as compared to Earth out there in the universe, and that from that spot these remains of life seeded planet Earth by being moved through interstellar space.
Well, can you kind of recast for our viewers how that process should work and what the problem is with it? Because I think your and other criticisms of it are very substantial. And
well, you're not going to move anything like the Murchison meteorite by starlight. That's the proposed mechanism.
Okay.
That starlight exerts a pressure, and
in
that
the vacuum
pressure
of space, it can push
move
things.
material through interstellar and interplanetary space. Well, I would agree it can move material through interplanetary space. I think that's how life from Earth got to Mars. One of the ways it got to Mars is little ejected dust from Earth was pushed by light pressure from the sun from Earth to other planets. But panspermia tries to take a bolder position in that and says that some distant star had a planet with life on it, and then that planet evaporated dust, and that dust got pushed by the light of the star to the solar system and eventually to Earth. As we pointed out last time, although this theory has been very popular for the past 25 years, we now know it doesn't work.
And what's the criticism? Why doesn't it work?
Why it doesn't work is that if you're talking about naked life, like some bacteria sitting out there in outer space, if you want a light pressure that's strong enough to move it through interstellar space, it's going to destroy it, break it down so you can't even recognize that it's the remains of life. That happens quickly.
And that's because of the radiation emanating from the very sun or star that's pushing it by light pressure.
Yeah, if you're going to have light pressure strong enough to move anything, you've got a lot of nasty radiation coming along with it.
Okay.
So that's going to be a problem. That's a problem even for our sun. But panspermia proponents have anticipated that and said, well, what we're going to do is shield the bacterium with a dust grain.
Okay.
So you got this 1 micron sized dust grain, and embedded inside it is a bacterium, and the dust grain protects the life from that harsh radiation. However, now we're talking about moving a dust grain rather than a bacterium.
And it's a lot heavier.
Much stronger light pressure to move a dust grain. And although that'll work in our solar system, if you're talking interstellar distances, you now need a star that is so bright in the emanation of its light that once again it's going to quickly break down that bacterium into a form that you can't possibly recognize, and of which is no use for constructing anything here on planet Earth. So it simply doesn't work.
So the larger you make it, the more you encase it, the bigger the problem and the bigger the source of the stellar source to push it, and the greater the radiation that's coming out anyway.
Right.
And we're talking about distances that would take literally millions and millions of years to get anything from place to place anyway, even if you could get it and have it
people
survive.
often don't recognize the kinds of extreme distances we're talking about. I mean, Pluto's 4 billion miles away. But if you're talking the nearest star, that's like 26 trillion miles away. A lot greater distance. I mean, a picture I've often used is you could think of our star. It's our sun's a typical star, almost 1 million miles in diameter. And that's a typical diameter for the stars. But if you were to model this million-mile diameter star down to the size of a grapefruit,
Okay.
how far would you have to go on that scale to find another star?
Okay.
And you know, we're filming this in Southern California. The answer is you'd have to go to Peru or Siberia before you would find another grapefruit.
That's
how
distances.
far apart
Okay.
the stars are.
All
And
right.
so when people talk about interstellar travel, I hate to pour down rain on the Star Trek fans.
Well, we all know that it's a myth anyway, but it's a fun one, and we engage in it for,
But when you really look realistically at the distances, you realize that even if it's technologically feasible, the economics is just incredible.
Well, and the lifespans of people. You were talking
Right,
about...
we only live 70, 80 years.
Right,
so-
and you'd have to have generations of people way down the line before they'd actually get there.
Right.
And would
right.
they want to be part of that mission by that point?
And as hard as it would be to transport a human being, far more difficult for any kind of natural mechanism to move life or even its remains.
Okay.
But the question is, this Murchison meteorite has this very slight excess. How did it get that excess?
Okay.
And when you look at Mars, you see that 4 billion years ago, it seemed to have a lot of liquid water. And that was the time when comets were raining down things like carbon dioxide and methane, ammonia, what people call the building blocks of life. They really aren't. They're
Right.
just very simple
Right.
chemicals. But they say we got the raw ingredients, we got the liquid water, and we notice this slight excess, and then maybe something exotic's going on that makes life automatic.
Okay.
Well, the rebuttal to that is take all of that stuff that you got going for you, put it together in the lab and see what you come up with, and you discover you don't get very far.
Okay.
Origin of life research, if anything, has simply demonstrated how amazingly designed life is,
Right.
and how intelligent the creator must be, how well educated he must be, that he can put this together. I mean, with all of our technology and education, sophistication and technology, we can't even come close.
We can't even figure out how the mechanism works or how the process
Right.
would even begin to work.
Right.
Okay.
And it's still an unanswered question how this Murchison meteorite got its excess left-handedness in a few amino acids.
Do you have a favorite hypothesis at this point as to how that might have happened?
Well, the favorite hypothesis, which I don't share, is that somehow this Murchison meteorite came close to a neutron star where its circularly polarized light developed a slight favorable response towards left-handed amino acids. Certain laboratory experiments indicate that if you shower these amino acids with very intense circularly polarized light, you can get a slight left-handed favoritism.
Okay.
But that's not exactly a very good environment for life, a neutron star.
No, I was just going to say that's the
exactly
opposite.
the
of
opposite.
conditions.
It's the worst
Right.
place that
Yeah,
you could go.
exactly.
And the idea that this Murchison meteorite could have ever been in that environment, went through outer space, got captured by the solar system, that really doesn't make sense either.
Okay.
It doesn't have any indication of that kind of origin. So it's an unanswered question. How did it get that very slight excess? Is that slight excess even believable? Is it there because of contamination with the Earth? I mean, maybe it got close to something going on here on planet Earth. I mean, that Murchison meteorite's been in some exotic environments, so
Okay.
I don't know. It's an unanswered question, but I don't certainly see it as any indication or help for the idea that life originated under natural conditions.
Right.
Life needs 100% left-handedness, not 52%,
Right. Okay.
but 100%. And that's the easiest step. I mean, the real problem is to sequence together the proteins, as we
Right.
see here in Earth life, and the RNA and the DNA. And we're going to be talking later about just some of the amazing things we're discovering in the cell, the organization there, how there's got to be a plan worked out in advance to make life even work.
Okay. So this is
So-
just really at this point, it's a lot of confidence, but it's because it's more of a reach, do you think, or?
An extreme reach by people who really don't understand just how incredibly complex life really is and how amazing the origin of life must have been. I mean, the idea that, well, life's been here on Earth for a long time, 3.86 billion years, it originated quickly, and everybody assumes it originated naturally. Well, who says it originated naturally?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It did originate in under 5 million years, but I just see there's additional proof
The
that
creator.
it must have happened
Yeah.
by the hand of a creator. Anyway, that kind of wraps up what we're talking about on Mars.
Okay.
We may have more updates as NASA continues to send more missions.
Sure, okay.
But what thrills me is the more we learn, the more evidence we're finding that the Earth has been designed by a creator God.
It's actually working to the Christian benefit, the Christian apologist's benefit, because much of this evidence, you know, at first it looks kind of threatening, and I know a lot of folks are a little bit concerned, and I've talked to some Christians who said, well, what happens if we find out there's life out there? Well, the problem is, the more we look at it, the more real science is coming out showing that life is divinely designed, that it's a very all-powerful, you know, the kind of things that we see in the words of the Bible.
Well, Mark, 6 months ago we were here producing some programs for our Reasons to Believe audience. And in the past 6 months, there have been 5 new design characteristics discovered that are necessary for planet Earth to support life, just for the possibility, the support of life.
Okay.
These 5 characteristics make the probability for a natural causation of the solar system for the support of life 100,000 times more remote
Than it already was.
than it already was.
Okay. And I'm sure we're going to get to that in the series, too, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about these in the
You know,
series.
it's less than 1 chance in 10 to the 79 now that...
I'll have you explain that to our audience at
Sure.
a later time, because
Right.
that's a tough one.
Okay.
Well, you have a, we're going to do some discussions on some of the 200 most frequently asked questions, but I think you wanted to make a point about these
Right.
questions.
Well, you know, we've gotten started on this series of looking at the 200. Actually, it's 202.
Okay, so if we keep upping that one, too.
Yeah, we do. But, you know, as people write letters, as they call in to our office with their questions, their skepticisms about the Christian faith, we find that questions repeat over and over again. And so these are the 200 most frequently asked questions that people express concerning their doubts about the Christian faith.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is take our audience here through those questions, giving them brief answers to them. And we've gotten through, I think, a couple of dozen, and we'll be moving through the remainder.
Yeah. Probably won't get to the 202
I
for
might
a
not get to
while.
all 200 in just this one episode of
Sure.
taping sessions.
Sure.
But the thing we've noticed at our office is that people keep thinking that we've got some kind of book where we publish detailed answers to these 200. That's not true. Where we developed these 200 most frequently answers to the 200 most frequently asked questions was a radio news spot. You know, we had prepared 4 radio programs, kind of like a 1-minute response
Okay.
to the most frequently asked questions.
These
The
are very
response-
short.
Extremely short.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at this. It's just like a couple
Yeah.
of paragraphs.
Just a paragraph
That's
and a
all.
half or so, and so that's not really what we're going to give.
Well, I'll tell you what, we did publish these at one time, and we chose to withdraw them.
Okay.
Because what we discovered was organizations that were not in line with what we were trying to claim that science is demonstrating the Christian faith. Were using these against us and literally making us say things that we didn't believe.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And the problem was the answers are so brief that they lead to that risk.
Right.
So we're only making them available to the people that volunteer for our organization, but we are making available the questions themselves. If people want to find out what the questions are,
We can make those available.
not the answers.
Okay.
So stop asking for the answers.
Yeah, okay. But we do have, and one thing that we ought to let the audience know is that in our response here, and the response that you're going to give, and we'll discuss a little bit, a lot more reference material that has been done on these things. I mean, there's been a lot produced.
Well,
and
that's
so-
what we're going to try to do. Give you a brief response to these questions, and eventually we'll put out a book, but give a brief response to these questions, then kind of show you where you can get more
Okay.
understanding on this.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of good books and stuff out there that people have produced, and we want to steer people in that direction so that you're not left hanging with an inadequate
Right.
answer. But I don't know what it's like with you. Sometimes I meet non-Christians, and they want a quick answer.
That's, you know, that's the interesting thing, is that I find a lot of non-Christians too. They ask for a question. They want to see if you have a reasonable answer.
Right.
And that's often as much as they want. It's we who are studying apologetics that often want to spend a lot more time digging into the material to make sure that we're understanding it correctly and develop a good response. And so a lot of the things that we have reflect that kind of interest as apologists. We want to make sure we've covered every
Well, you know,
background.
Mark, you're aware that my wife comes from a background of being an English professor, and she's the one that keeps reminding me and the rest of our scientific team, you got to come across as a reporter. You got to launch off with a very quick summary of the thing and realize that's all most people want. They'll
Right.
stop listening to you
Right, okay.
after they got the quick answer, and we want to give them all the insights and details,
Details
etc.
way beyond their interest.
And
right.
a lot of people want that, but many do not.
Okay.
And so this is an attempt to give you a quick response.
Okay.
And yes, we got longer responses to a lot of these questions, but this is a chance to get a quick response. And I think this one we're going to lead off with in this episode fits that category.
Well, let's talk about it. You know, the question, one of the questions that we get, and it's near the top 10 of our list of questions that we do get, is death seems so horrible. Why would God, a God of love, make us go through such a terrible process?
What's such a frequently asked question? You know, why death? Why would God take us through that kind of pain? None of us enjoy it. When we all kind of fear a little bit how it's going to feel as we go through
Sure.
that valley. And it was such a frequently asked question, and one that I find a lot of Christians avoid. Death, don't want to talk about that one. You know, let's talk about something else.
Okay.
And we said, no, this is a question that's really on the hearts of many secular people. They want a response from Christians on the issue of death. And that's why we did 4 whole episodes. I mean, if you've been watching Reasons to Believe for a long time, you'll remember that we did 4 half-hour programs on the subject of God's mercy in death. How God literally blessed us with the gift of physical death so that we can be delivered from the far worse consequences of the spiritual death that indwells each one of us.
Right.
That's God's tool. And we're not going to try to cover everything that was in those 4 things.
Sure, but we can give a short summary of some of the highlights.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Okay.
And I think our first point is there's a lot of scripture, a lot of verses in the Bible that deal with the subject of death. And we've prepared a list of those scriptures. And that's kind of what we did in the 4-part series. We looked at all the places in the Bible where it talks about young people who are righteous dying in their youth, and why that was a blessing to those young people. And then we took you through the verses that dealt with the theme of old people who are righteous, living far beyond their allotted time. Why does God have them linger here on planet Earth for so long? Why doesn't He just take them to heaven? And how that's also a blessing, that God will extend the life in order
of some. Right.
Righteous people, and actually does it to increase the reward. That's also why He blesses young people with death. God's goal for righteous people is to enhance the reward in the kingdom of heaven, the new creation. He wants you to get that maximum reward. And so He structures the circumstances in your life, the period of time in which you live, in order to guarantee that you get that maximum reward. But it also works for those that are rebelling against God's authority. He will shorten the life of some in order to minimize the torment that they'll have to experience in the lake of fire. God does not want anyone to experience any more than what is absolutely necessary. And I think we've done some episodes where He talked about how even the torment in hell is a blessing.
We have. Yeah.
God does that in order to make conditions in hell as ideal as possible for the people who insist on rebelling against His authority. But then we've all known people who have been wicked and rebellious and have lived to be 80, 90, 100 years, and we say, why does God put up with that?
Right, exactly.
Irascible so-and-so. And the point is, God sees the potential for repentance.
Right, and gives them as much time as possible in their life.
Any chance that they could repent and submit to the authority of God and receive the blessings of the kingdom of heaven, He wants to make sure that that takes place. And I've had relatives who have, lived on late in their life, who become Christians in the last few months. I've had friends, just months or days before they die, they come to faith in Jesus Christ.
We see a lot of spiritual movement in the last few days, few hours of some people's lives, don't we?
We really do.
As much as 95% or 98% of the spiritual movement we'll ever see in them comes in those last few hours. Perhaps they've been on deathbed.
People have a habit of ignoring God. And it's like when you're at the gates of death, you begin to think about things.
It's time to pay attention.
The gas in your car doesn't make that much of a significant point in your life anymore. What you eat's not that significant.
Right.
The physical things seem to fade away, and you think about other things.
Yeah.
That's why it tells us in the Bible it's good to think about death early in our life.
And that's a hard thing for young people too. I noticed that. I know when I was young, in fact, I remember being very young and thought of myself pretty much invincible when I was in the Marines. I think that's why wars are for young people in a way. You don't have that sense of death until you get older. But it's...
Well, Mark, my own personal sense of death as a teenager, when I realized that physical death was a significant risk, even in my teens, it started me to think about spiritual things that up until then I never even had thought about. And we've covered this before, but I think that's important, that the Bible lays us some general principles about why we go through death. Death is a tool that God uses to limit the spread of evil.
Right.
Give evil people a long time to live, they can do a lot of damage, and God uses death as a tool to keep things in check. That's the first thing God did when we rebelled in the Garden of Eden, is He blessed us with physical death.
Right.
And it's a way to keep our evil in check. That's why He doesn't let us live that long. The Bible's got a lot of good things to say about why we need to die, why it's good for us to die, and we're simply trying to do is encourage people to look at those scripture references.
And that's
if
something
people
worthy
want the references, we can provide them.
And that would be a worthwhile study, to spend some time studying this issue.
You know, without anybody telling you what's going on, just go through the scriptures and find out for yourself what God's saying to you.
Okay.
Great. Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we bring you the news of the latest discoveries, scientific discoveries for the existence of God, the reliability of the Bible, and evidence for the Christian faith, not just here from Earth, but from the solar system and indeed the entire universe. In fact, the last couple of episodes we've been talking about Mars and the Pathfinder mission. We thought we would go to the opposite end of the scientific spectrum, from astrophysics over to anthropology, and inform you about some of the startling new discoveries in the frontiers of anthropological research. Take it back a few months. We wrote this up on our newsletter. It's a discovery of Neanderthal nasal capacities. Two famous American anthropologists, Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz, wrote a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences describing their running around to museums around the world. And unlike other bipedal primate species, with the Neanderthals, we have a lot of skeletal evidence, almost 100 complete skeletons. And so what Ian and Jeffrey did was run around at different museums and re-examine the skulls of Neanderthals. Now, these have been examined for decades, but they were looking at one particular feature that no one else had ever studied, and that was the nasal capacity of these Neanderthals. And they were surprised to discover just how huge the nasal capacities of the Neanderthal really were. I mean, these are bipedal primate species that lived about 100,000 to 50,000 years ago here on Earth, and were fairly abundant. And Ian and Jeffrey discovered that the nasal capacity of these creatures was so enormous that it rules out any possibility that Neanderthal is biologically linked to human beings. And Mark...
I'd be curious to see how that fits. I mean, it seems like one of the advantages that a human would have if he's a long-distance runner or even a short-distance runner is an increased nasal capacity. But you suggest, or the research suggests, that this is not the case with the Neanderthals. What's going on with these
Yeah, I struggle with sinus problems myself.
I do too. We all do, especially in Southern California when pollen season hits, yeah.
And you know, Neanderthal was definitely more physically robust than we are, and maybe had a lifestyle where that larger nasal capacity was an advantage for his survival. That's possible. But Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz's point is that this is so huge compared to modern humans that the idea that we are descended from Neanderthal must be rejected.
Why specifically? Why is it there's...
I mean, we're only talking a few tens of thousands of years. The last Neanderthal died out, say, 40, 50,000 years ago.
Okay.
And there isn't enough time from that point
to have the significant
to human
changes.
beings
Okay.
where if you're appealing to natural evolutionary processes, mutations and a natural selection as a means by which we, quote, evolved from this huge nasal capacity to our small nasal capacity, you could say that those natural processes cannot produce that radical of a change that fast. That's why they're concluding that there can't be a biological link between Neanderthals and human beings. We cannot be descended in any way from a previously existing Neanderthal species. Neanderthals are not our ancestors, is what they're saying.
Okay. Well, that's good because that rules out one aspect. But I understand that there's some new discoveries going on as well that suggest that they are very different.
Before we move on to that, in their research paper, and Ian's famous for promoting the atheistic worldview.
Oh, okay.
And so it's interesting that this is coming from someone with that worldview that, we're not related to the Neanderthal. We're not linked to the Neanderthal. But the paper actually came up with a stronger statement than that. It said that the measured nasal capacities were so enormous that they could not suggest a link for how Neanderthal got there.
To any other creature before it? And
is it any? They looked at all the primates.
Okay.
None of the primates, either currently existing or existing in the fossil record, have nasal capacities of that dimension. And so their conclusion was, even given the time scale in which primates have been wandering upon the face of the earth, it's simply not possible that natural process evolution could derive such a huge nasal capacity from any other primate, which means they were concluding that Neanderthal had no biological links to any existing or previous existing primate species.
Well, this is kind of a knife in the heart of Darwinist evolutionary theories.
It really is a knife in the heart of any naturalist interpretation for how advanced mammals got here in the face of the earth.
Right.
And actually the paper had an even stronger statement. They said we see no link with human beings as being possible, no link with any other primate being possible. We can't even find a link with any other mammal.
Oh man, that's a really strong statement.
Neanderthal is such a sharply distinct situation in terms of the nasal capacities. And so what we were suggesting in our newsletter article, of course, this strengthens the Christian doctrine that human beings are specially created by God, not descended from any other existing species or previously existing species, but specially created by God himself. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, just a few thousands of years ago, is what we're talking about. And this would lend support to that conclusion. But I see it as also lending support to the conclusion that God not only specially created human beings,
but also other animals.
He must have specially created at least the Neanderthal, and probably other species as well. The scientific evidence is coming in that way.
And this species is so distinct as to be kind of a real barb in their whole idea, isn't it? Now, I wonder if we'll expect to see these kinds of things going on with other species of mammals. Do you think there's a possibility of that?
Well, that I think will happen. I mean, we just simply haven't looked to be able to draw those kinds of conclusions. Neanderthal is the first one where we've done these kinds of studies to that depth. So, but it's interesting the conclusion is being drawn by these non-theistic researchers.
Is there any comment by these non-theistic researchers as to what might have happened?
No, as you look at the paper, they write the paper as if it's got nothing to do with the creation, evolution debate or the existence of God. They just kind of, here are the facts, folks, and we don't see any links being possible. And the paper ends there. So yeah, I guess from your political science background, it'd be good to say, well, guys, what does this mean?
What's the implication of this?
What are the worldview implications? That's very appropriate.
I wonder what it might be doing to them personally on a personal level. I wonder if they're rethinking their position.
Well, Mark, as you've indicated, there's more to the puzzle than this. And this just came out in...
oh, we heard about it. I just heard this recently,
It's just a few days ago in the newspaper. Announcing on the front page, Neanderthal DNA disproves link. So we don't have just the nasal capacity situation. For the first time in Germany, somebody was able to recover DNA from a Neanderthal fossil find.
Now, how did they do that? Was it recovering from the bones?
Well, I was reading this. I mean, this hasn't come out in the peer-reviewed literature yet.
Okay.
I mean, I'm going to have to wait a couple of weeks before I can tell you exactly what's going on.
Okay.
But what the newspaper articles have been talking about is it was in the bone itself. And yeah, if you get a little bit of bone marrow somehow preserved, then you've got the potential of extracting some DNA.
Okay.
So, or maybe they found a little bit of skin that was attached that was somehow preserved.
Okay.
And they might have got the DNA that way.
Okay.
But yeah, the newspaper articles I've read have not gotten down to that level of detail that should be forthcoming when this finally gets into the peer-reviewed literature.
I thought it was printed in Cell, in the journal Cell.
Yeah.
Is that
so
a
when
popular?
that comes out,
okay.
We'll be able to.
So that's like an
check it out.
advanced discussion of what's going to come out in this
Right.
journal Cell. Okay.
Yeah, we're telling you stuff that's really breaking news.
Breaking news
Right.
as it's happening. Yeah, I remember
So-
hearing about this just a few days ago on the news. You know, definitive proof that there's no DNA link to modern human beings.
Well, what they discovered was that the DNA of Neanderthal is so radically different compared to modern humans that it's impossible for the chemical clocks to run fast enough under natural conditions to generate human beings from Neanderthal.
Chemical clocks. What do you mean by chemical clocks?
Well, I mean, the cells in your body, the RNA, the DNA, the proteins, are slowly mutating as your body's being subjected to cosmic rays, ultraviolet radiation, and other stresses in the environment. And you know, this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And what certain biochemists try to do is measure the rate of the accumulation of mutations in different kinds of molecules in living organisms.
Okay.
And so they can look at human beings, for example, and say, well, this is the natural evolutionary rate.
Okay.
This is the rate of mutations we observe under natural conditions. And then you project that over time and say, is that rate sufficient
Okay.
to explain the differences? Given that Neanderthal dates back, say, 50 to 150,000 years ago, human beings show up on the scene, say, 20 to 40, 50,000 years ago. Is there enough time between the appearance of modern humans and the extinction of Neanderthals for these differences to arise under natural conditions? And the answer very definitively is no. With great assurance we can say that's impossible, that the DNA of a Neanderthal could have evolved under natural conditions into the DNA of a human being.
Okay.
That can't happen.
Okay.
There simply isn't sufficient time for that to take place. So Neanderthal cannot possibly be our relative. Based on the nasal capacities, and now we
on
can
the
draw
DNA.
the same conclusion based on the DNA. Neanderthal has been ruled out. Now, of course, what the non-theists are trying to suggest is that both Neanderthal and human beings are related to some
Distant ancestral
bipedal primate creature that existed, say, 500,000 to 1 million years ago.
Right.
However, the fossil evidence we have for such bipedal creatures is that they were far different from us than the Neanderthal is. This isn't really helping their case. They're now having to appeal to a creature that's much more distinct from us than Neanderthal.
Which is even more remote a chance that there's any linkage.
Right. And see,
and
the
we'll
time
find any
scale
linkage.
isn't that great. We're only talking a few 100,000 years.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, given that Neanderthal was our best hope, now that's been ruled out. We got to go to something that's a much weaker proposition.
Let's put this in the context for our viewers because I think it's interesting. Neanderthal was that the leading candidate for a recent ancestor for humans up until very recently?
Well, it's a leading candidate, or was a leading candidate, in the sense that Neanderthal looked most like us.
Of all the various bipedal
Had a
primates.
large cranial capacity and had a lot of function. In fact, until recently, people have said, you know, if you saw a Neanderthal dressed in a business suit getting on the subway, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
That's not quite true, is it, though?
Well, I mean, there's certain anatomical distinctives, even before Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz's research that indicated that that was not the case. But 3 years ago it was. 3 years ago, I remember reading the textbooks. There's nothing anatomically distinct about Neanderthal compared to modern humans. We cannot recognize anything in the fossils that shows that they're distinct, and therefore they were saying Neanderthal must be part of the human lineage, because we don't see any fossil distinctives. Well, about a couple years ago, they were saying if we look carefully at the skulls, we do see some things. There's a bone structure here in the jaw in the Neanderthal that makes it able to have a far stronger jaw muscle.
Okay.
And we can understand from the conditions in which Neanderthal lived why they would need that much more powerful jaw muscle.
Sure.
We don't have it, they did.
Yeah.
And then there's a little hole that admits a spinal cord into the skull of all primates. And I forget which it is, but with human beings and Neanderthals, one has an elliptical shape and one has a circular shape. Now, people were overlooking these distinctives and saying, well, probably what happened is the young children of modern humans and the young children of Neanderthals had the same kind of spinal column hole in the skull and the same jaw structure, but their environment caused the skeletal structure to change as they
environmental
became adults.
stresses and hardships, yeah.
And they said, you know, since we don't have any fossils of Neanderthal infants, that's a possibility.
Oh, okay.
But then they discovered some fossils of Neanderthal infants, and the Neanderthal infants had the same distinctives as Neanderthal
the parents.
Adults. So just 2 years ago, anthropologists changed their position. Whereas they were saying Neanderthal was anatomically identical to human beings, they're now saying that Neanderthal had small anatomical distinctives. Come along Jeffrey Schwartz and Ian Tattersall, it's no longer a small anatomical distinctive, it's a huge anatomical distinctive, and then comes along these German researchers and say, we found the DNA.
Yeah.
And chemically, there's a radical difference.
Okay.
And now the anthropological community has concluded Neanderthal is not our cousin.
Yeah. Now, did Neanderthals have tools? And was that one of the
They
arguments?
used tools.
They used a tool, didn't they?
And there's some evidence that they may have been burying their dead, in the sense that we find tools beside the skeletal remains of a Neanderthal.
So like a burial, maybe not a ceremony, but some kind of habit, like the elephants do. And
well, yeah, some have even been suggesting that these Neanderthals worship like we do, and I'm saying that's a stretch. All we have found is some evidence that they might have buried their dead and put some tool stuff with them. To conclude that that's a religious ceremony, in my opinion, is a real stretch.
Sure, sure.
And so I'm still classifying Neanderthal as an intelligent, tool-using bipedal primate, but not a human, in the sense that we see no evidence for spirit expression on the part of Neanderthal, whereas that spirit expression evidence is extensive for human beings. I mean, it's abundant. You find religious relics everywhere in the digs of modern humans.
Okay.
So,
well, that's interesting. I appreciate the discoveries that are coming out. Is there anything else that you need to talk about? Because I know that there's one other discovery we wanted to get to today.
right. Well, this is also in the arena of anthropology. But the thing I want to emphasize is that this definitively shows that Neanderthal cannot have anything to do with human beings.
Okay.
More than that, it really demonstrates that just like human beings are specially created, Neanderthals
Are specially
are
created.
specially created, and maybe lots of other species are specially created, like the Bible states.
Right.
We now are getting and accumulating scientific evidence for what we see described in Genesis on the 5th and 6th creation days, how God specially creates the birds, the mammals, and the human beings.
Right.
And it'll be exciting to watch the
Well, let's hope that the model
discoveries.
that these two have given us, you know, looking to some of those anatomical differences, will start lending scientists to do that with other fossil remains, and maybe they'll start seeing distinctions there that they haven't been looking for in the past.
Well, for example, if the naturalists are right, that all life evolves from a primitive creature existed long ago in the past and there's this gradual descent, then we would expect that the changes we see in the bones, what they call the morphology, the fossil evidence, that should match the chemical evidence. So the fact that we're able to compare DNA against the fossil changes, the DNA changes versus the fossil changes, that gives a powerful tool for testing whether it's creation or natural process evolution.
Okay.
And this is really the first case where we've been able to get that chemical evidence compared against the morphological evidence, and definitively draw the conclusion that the natural evolution model
Just not
is
cutting
not
it.
correct. The creation model is the way to go.
Right.
And we can look forward to that happening for lots of species in the future, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a newer discovery, and I got that in this research paper here. This was in Nature. Hey, Mark, this is just a couple of weeks ago, published in Nature, and it's a short paper, and it's looking at the human eye. And you know, as you read the paper, you say, why wasn't this published ages ago? I mean, this came out of Japan. A couple of Japanese anthropologists, Hiromi Kobayashi and Shiro Kobshima, looked at the human eye and compared the human eye with the eyes of other primates and mammals,
Okay.
and concluded the obvious, that when you look at human beings and our eyes, you see that we have a lot of white exposed material on our eyeball. We have a small iris and a lot of white around the iris.
Okay.
The other thing that they were picking up on is that human beings have been blessed with a muscle structure around the eyeball that allows our eye to move easily and quickly in a lot of different directions. And this gives us the possibility to communicate with one another through our eyes.
Nonverbal communication.
Nonverbal communication.
Okay.
And they were making the point that, yeah, body language obviously is an important means of communication for all advanced mammals. But we have the unique capacity to communicate powerfully through our eyes. And we're the only species that has that capacity. We're the only species that has all this white. You say, what does the white do for you? Well, it allows me to see where you're looking. In other words, I could look in your eyes and I can tell whether you're looking at me or you're looking at the cameraman or you're looking at somebody else.
Right, or looking at the background.
Because I compare the position of your iris with the rest of the white around your eye. And, you know, incredibly, I can do this from 50, 60 feet away.
Yeah.
I look at my experience and your experience. You do a lot of teaching. I do a lot of teaching.
That's how we see what the students are doing, whether they're paying attention, whether they're nodding off, whether they're thinking about something else.
It gives us the capacity to lecture to 300 people and have that individual communication with members in that 300-person audience. We're the only species that could do that. Now, you know, these guys don't get into that. They just simply show how different we are.
Okay.
That we have this huge amount of white. They make the point that for most primates and mammals, there isn't white. You just have a dark background. You really can't tell without getting really close to the animal what is the iris and what is the background of the eyeball.
Okay. Oh,
you've got this brown iris and you've got a brown background.
Right, yeah. In fact, when you think of cat's eyes and the like, you think of the brown
Yeah.
and the way that they're shaped.
So, and most animals have a very large iris. We got a tiny iris. And most animals can't move their eyes easily. He says, you look at other animals, they're doing a lot of head movement.
Well, you know, I remember my dog, you know, for him to communicate with me, he had to look me straight on. And, you know, I mean, what limited communication we had, but it's not like I can do with you. I can look this way physically with my face and then turn my eyes towards you and see what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of communication is done that way when we don't even think of it, do we?
Right.
That animals cannot do. You think of dogs barking to another group of dogs, you know, an individual dog, they just shout. They don't look at each one and focus in on them.
Right. We can do that.
Well, that's interesting.
We can focus, we can pick people out of a crowd and communicate with them one-on-one. Now, you could say, why, I mean, if you're trying to explain this by natural process, what you have to explain is what in the environment would motivate some pre-ancestral human being to evolve an eye structure of this degree of complexity and distinction that fast? You know, people giving physics lectures to 300 students
didn't happen until modern times.
It's not something that you would expect that natural process would be anticipating 40,000 years ago.
Right, exactly.
I mean, how would these natural processes be aware that we were going to need that capacity at the end of the 20th century?
Right, exactly. There's nothing in nature to suggest that would be a need in the future, is there? On its own.
On its own. I mean,
Unless
it's not
built
something.
in.
Well, I mean, kind of what they're suggesting is that that gives us an advantage in hunting. The fact that, say, a group of us could go out into the field, and because of our eyes being structured the way we were, we could signal to one another and be more efficient hunters. But for me, the proof of that is, does it really give us a distinct advantage over other creatures of life that hunt in packs? And the thing we notice is we human beings aren't as good at group hunting as dogs are. They don't have the high ball capacities we do, and yet they do a better job. And really what we recognize is that the way our eyes are structured help us in our social communication.
Okay.
Maybe finding a date in the bar, for example.
Well, give them the eye, and there's a whole lot of mythology and
Sure.
legend that goes around how you look at people, how you're attractive to people, or tell people you don't want any part of their life.
Right.
By the way you look at people.
It's a much more useful tool, say, in debating and teaching.
Yeah.
And social communication, like in going to church and trying to catch somebody's attention across the aisle.
Sure. If you're looking at them,
Right.
and they can tell from the long distance off, they'll start paying attention.
But these big churches didn't exist back in the days when we had this capacity.
Sure.
And the thing we notice is that we have not been enhancing our eyeball capacities over the past few thousand years. I mean,
No, we haven't.
as we've had more and more of a need for this eyeball communication, the eyeball is still the same as it was in the days of Julius Caesar. Nothing significant has happened there. But I also credit these guys with pointing out just how helpful this is. Anthropologists have assumed that our social communication is voice.
That's an interesting
I think
idea.
what this is alerting us to is that God designed us with a lot of powerful tools to facilitate our social communication and our intellectual development. And it's not just our voice. There's a lot more going on than just our voice. The eyes have been underrated.
Underrated for a long time, and there's a purpose for it, because God does encourage us for intimacy with in marriage relationships and family relationships, church and other affiliations that we have. He's encouraged us and built that tools in.
Yeah, what if I didn't have this eye capacity? What a big difference it would make in my life in the church, in front of my Sunday school class, or in front of a university lecture hall.
Sure.
I mean, we'd be losing a lot.
Yeah.
And so God's blessed us with this, and obviously this is not something you're going to evolve by natural process. I mean, look at the muscles that are necessary. It's not just the white of our eyes and the iris, kind of the physical characteristics of the eye. It's the fact that you need this whole new nervous system and muscle system to make this all work. You've got to be able to use the eye and move it around to make this all happen.
And I think in one of the shows that we did previously, David Berlinski mentioned the whole point that we can't recreate anything like this in a laboratory, even if we've tried.
We can't even make an eye like this on our own. So the idea that this is something that naturally evolved from a much more primitive state just doesn't hold water. One more piece of evidence that we human beings are specially created by God, descendants of Adam and Eve.
Good deal. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we try to keep you informed on the latest scientific discoveries and how they give us more evidences for the Christian faith and reliability of the Bible. A program, too, where we've been reviewing the 200 most frequently asked questions that our Reasons to Believe organization receives from skeptics, and some appropriate answers to those questions and concerns. Today, we'd like to revisit the subject of UFOs. This is something that we dedicated a whole hour of programming to 4 years ago. We did a 1-hour documentary on this, and it's a program and a video that's generated the strongest interest over the years in our organization. But a lot has happened in the last 4 years that we want to tell you about. In fact, 3 of us at Reasons to Believe are engaged in writing a book giving an update on this subject of UFOs, kind of a scientific perspective, hard-nosed perspective on the subject of UFOs and extraterrestrial life. And joining Dr. Mark Clark and myself, we have Ken Samples. Ken is the newest member of our Reasons to Believe team. He has just joined us as the Director of Publications and will be working with our scientists and writing books. But when we discovered what Ken Samples had to offer in terms of his background and academic experience, we recruited him to help us with this book project on UFOs and extraterrestrials. So Ken, I'm going to begin by asking you to share briefly with the viewers how you became a Christian and how you got involved in apologetics and then with reasons to believe, and then we'll get into the subject of what's new in terms of UFOs.
Well, Hugh, I was raised in a nominal Christian family. That is...
here in America, I presume.
In the United States,
all right.
Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to church occasionally, mostly on holidays and things of that nature. But by the time I reached high school, I began to wonder whether life had a lot of meaning and purpose and significance. And being somewhat of a questioner and a thinker even as a young man, I began to be very dissatisfied with most of the things in my life. Playing sports, various social activities didn't seem to give me the kind of purpose and significance I was looking for. And so when I went to college, my freshman year in college, I immediately took some philosophy classes and felt that was my home. And of course, philosophy is interested in the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Is there a God? Is there afterlife? And those questions provoked even deeper thought. And unfortunately, there was a death in my family. My brother had died prematurely. And this just kind of intensified that sense of trying to find a purpose. My sister, who had become a Christian about 6 months earlier, gave me a book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity. And I literally devoured the book. I read it probably in a couple settings. And it was for the first time after reading Lewis's book that I understood what Christianity was about. I had been raised believing in God, but it was the first time that I understood that Jesus Christ was the God-man, that his mission here on earth was to bring us to salvation. So upon reading that book, by the grace of God, I was converted to the faith.
Was this still in your high school or in college at this point, or were you still in philosophy classes?
Yes, I was. This was probably between my freshman and sophomore year in college. And immediately taking philosophy classes, people began to throw challenges my way. I began reading.
So you let people know what you had done.
Oh yes, I was very bold in the classroom, and the teachers began throwing objections my way, and I began to wonder, can my faith, which has had such a existential or an inner purpose and meaning to my life, can it really stand up to rigorous scientific, philosophical examination? And that's where apologetics came in. I began searching for answers to many of these questions.
It might help just to redefine again apologetics.
Yeah, that's a good one. I was just going to suggest that.
Very good. Well, the word apologetics is not as threatening as it may seem. It actually comes right out of the New Testament. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15 that we should give an answer for our faith. Apologia is the Greek word meaning to give a reasoned defense. And in philosophy, which is a very skeptical field traditionally, I was challenged. How do I know that God exists? How do I know that Jesus is the Messiah? Aren't all religions just as good as any other? And fortunately, I had some good Christian mentors who pointed me to people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. I began and continued to read C.S. Lewis. So apologetics became part of my life. It's not enough to preach the gospel. In a pluralistic and secular society, we've got to defend it. And so that was really my introduction to apologetics.
Was when you were first studying philosophy, did you find the kind of approach the philosophers take unsatisfying the first year that you were in it? I mean, you know, because you suggested that you took philosophy, it was asking all the big questions, but it wasn't providing the answers. Is that part of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, Mark. I felt very stimulated intellectually in philosophy, but ultimately it left me spiritually dry. That is, it didn't give me the kind of outlook and worldview that I was looking for. And subsequently in reading Christian philosophers, I began to realize that your heart and your head can go together. And that some of the greatest thinkers in the history of Western civilization have been Christians, both in the area of science and in the area of philosophy. And so, by the grace of God, the Lord seemed to prepare me and open the door for an apologetics ministry.
Oh, great. And how did that begin and develop?
Well, I began finishing up my undergraduate work, and I met Walter Martin, who was a Christian apologist, and ultimately began working in the area of apologetics.
So after your degree, you went to work for Walter Martin's organization?
I did. I was working for the Christian Research Institute, and I was continuing to go to graduate school. And that opened a lot of doors. I began to realize that we need a church that's well educated. We need Christians who can speak articulately to the questions that are raised. And I also began to realize that there were still a lot of objections to the faith, and so that led me to doing some radio programs. And up until recently, I joined the Reasons to Believe staff, and I can't tell you how important I think it is to communicate to college students especially, and Mark, I think you can relate to this, to be able to communicate to college students that the Christian faith has nothing to fear from scientific analysis.
Now, you've been a professor yourself on the university campus. You want to share a little bit about your experiences there?
Yes. For 8 years, I served as a philosophy instructor at Cerritos College, primarily at Cerritos, but I taught at a number of other schools as an adjunct instructor. And that really cemented my interest and my direction in apologetics. I began to see that students were asking some of the very same questions. How can I trust the Bible? How do you know it's not filled with myths? Doesn't evolution disprove the Bible? What about the problem of evil? Doesn't that make God and belief in God untenable? And I began to realize that many of these college students were really interested in finding answers, but there weren't a lot of answers being given. So I spent about 8 years at Cerritos teaching philosophy and religion courses.
Well, you mentioned Cerritos. Have you taught primarily at secular universities?
Virtually all of my period of instruction was at California community colleges. I did teach a few courses at some Christian institutions, but I actually enjoyed the secular environment because frankly, you have an audience virtually all the time of people who are basically asking questions of truth. And I found it to be a place where I could continue to work through apologetic issues and philosophical and religious views.
I get that. I just recently had it. A graduate student of mine, looked at me and said, boy, I can't believe you're a Christian and you're doing what you're doing. And I said, why? I thought he'd be objected to the fact that I do strategic studies. And he says, no. He says, you always tell us to doubt the text, to look at it and go critically examine it. And how are you doing it with the Bible? It opened up a wonderful door. We spent an hour and a half or so talking about what it means to look at the Word of God, to be critical, to be skeptical, to not just take dogmatic answers for the face value, but then to go beyond that and to see the truth behind it. It opens up wonderful doors, I find, at secular campuses, and they're not as afraid to look at it and ask questions as we might think.
Well, the thing I've observed about the secular university campus is the audience there is spiritually starved. They've gone for, say, 20, 25 years of their life, and no teacher has addressed these big questions. It's, don't think about that, just focus on your studies.
Right.
By the time they're a university student, they have all this pent-up hunger that hasn't had a chance to get released. So you as a Christian academic stand up in front of them and just suddenly the floodgates open up. And it's a wonderful opportunity to, but how important it is to make sure we're responding with sound reasons to believe.
Correct, exactly.
So, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident, so-called.
Yes.
And it certainly has focused attention on UFOs like never before in our country. And
well, we should probably make mention of a couple of recent things. The U.S. Air Force just came out with another study. It was called for by the General Accounting Office. The GAO was tasked by Congress to look at and investigate what the Air Force supposedly knew about its cover-up or dealings with Roswell. And they did a report, I think it came out in '94 and '92, and then the GAO was asked to look at it further, and so the Air Force just recently came out with its latest report. Now, I have to say this, the Air Force did a pretty good job on the report, but their public relations arm was horrible. They gave some pretty sloppy answers to reporters' questions, and it looked like, and it fuels this cover-up conspiracy stuff.
Well,
But,
I see the book cover right here. It's called The Roswell Report, subtitled Case Closed. And it's like that subtitle is bound to generate a strong public reaction. This is coming from the government. You know, does the government ever close any case properly?
Exactly. Yeah, it's got to be another conspiracy cover-up. They're
So-
just trying to slam the door on investigating. Yeah.
Mark, you reminded me something we've overlooked in previous programs. You know, we've done a few programs on life on Mars, the possibility of life on Mars. And in both programs, we neglected to give appropriate credit to the astronomers that are contributing to our team.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad you mentioned. He's from University of Washington.
Well, there's two astronomers I wanted to credit with helping us with the content of those two programs, and that was Dr. George Lebo of the University of Florida and Dr. Guillermo Gonzalez of the University of Washington. And I really appreciate both of these gentlemen that are part of our volunteer research science team who funneled to us key research papers that really help us to recognize the discoveries about design of the solar system that the public's not hearing about, not even the research community. So we're grateful for the team of scientists that backs up our organization.
And we should probably also add there's a flood of scientists out there who support this ministry and who feed you papers that are before they're even coming out in the journals, and that's why we're able to stay on the cutting edge of these discoveries.
Exactly. The fact that we're getting this stuff even in preprint form,
yeah,
it really does help us to stay on the very cutting edge. So
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Something that we need to give appropriate credit for.
Sure.
So thanks. But back to the
aliens.
Roswell stuff.
Back to aliens, right?
Right. And you know, we go back to that program we did 4 years ago. Our take on it was that, yeah, we have this 1947 incident in Roswell, New Mexico, and there's these so-called bodies of UFO aliens and a craft that's being secretly covered up by the U.S. government. They don't want us to know that we've been invaded by these extraterrestrials. And it just how in a country like the United States, the idea of such a cover-up being pulled off by a government as security weak as ours loses credibility quickly as the years pass.
I can just tell you know, from my perspective, I just got back from Washington, D.C. and spent some time with some of my colleagues who work in the Senate and in the CIA and places like that, and it's just absolutely, and in fact, I've got plenty of students who are from the Air Force, and it's a joke among us. You know, we're covering up all these wonderful things. It's not possible to be covered up because secrets in Washington do not last. I mean, in my field, strategic studies, 95 to 96%, and I've had high clearances, 95 to 96% of everything you need to know is out in the public domain if you're able to read. And if that's the case with, you know, black programs like the stealth fighter, the stealth bomber, and the various weapons programs that are attempted to really put an effort on to keep secret, it's not possible for these other things. And it's funny because even just recently, I don't know if you remember, about 3 or 4 months ago, a book was produced by a former staff member of Senator Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond, unfortunately, signed the foreword to it because he was a former staff member, loyal person. And this person claims, this former staff member, that in his book that all the wonderful advanced technology we have came from that alien ship in Roswell.
Sure.
Fiber optics, computer chip technology. And the senator had no idea it was in the book. He just wrote it on the basis of his career. And that's what lends credence to these conspiracy theories. And it's really a sad thing, and it's unfortunately just flat untrue.
Well, I think one of the themes in that program was do not believe anything for which there is a lack of tangible evidence.
Right.
No one could ever produce any artifact from that crash incident. You couldn't actually see these so-called bodies. All you saw were these fuzzy photographs, and you know, it's been 50 years. And you know, as testimony to how good our government is in covering up really important secrets, we have Watergate. And all we're talking about is a single audio tape. And the cover-up was only successful for 11 days.
Yeah.
And here we're talking 50 years.
Yeah.
So,
involving literally millions of people.
Right.
That's the problem.
but you know what? I'm finding that when this stuff ran, the Roswell Report, case closed, it did have a significant change in convincing people that, you know, this really is incredible evidence of UFOs. Of course, there were the diehards who said, just another cover-up. But in spite of the bad subtitle, I don't know what you're thinking, Mark, but my perspective was, I think this has been a positive step.
I think so, and there's a couple of other reports that are not mentioned, but the Air Force report is in fact 2 reports, and they're, I think, the first one's several hundred pages. This one, the latest one, is I think 900 pages, and it's accessible. You can buy it through the U.S. government printing office. I mean, you can look at the documents. You can go to the Air Force internet site and look and see the pictures of the crash dummies that were in that weather balloon test, pictures from that original, and what looked like spaceship was in fact things that we normally use for web testing.
Sure.
And the other thing that was, the CIA has done a series of reports. They're opening up. A lot of secrets from the Cold War are now being released. A whole series of projects, and one of them is the CIA's role involved in it, and they were looking at it in the 50s for a brief period of time because of the Soviet involvement and interest in it. But it lasted only about 5 or 7 years.
And consider the context of 1947. The Soviets were on the verge of discovering the atomic bomb. We had a monopoly on the atomic bomb at that point. And so there was a lot of motivation in terms of the U.S. Air Force to make sure that certain defense secrets not get out. And so that helps me to understand why they handled the Roswell incident the way they handled it.
Sure.
Times have changed. That wouldn't happen today.
No,
back in 47, when you got McCarthy and all that going on,
that kicks in a little bit later.
Makes a lot of sense.
It sure does. So, and they had to look at it, but they have pretty much released all interest in it back in the earlier mid-50s, I believe. So the CIA's not even involved. And yet the conspiracies will go on, and we just have to, I mean, it was popularized in that movie Independence Day a little over a year ago, that in fact they have that spaceship, they have the aliens. But I think the more that we see movies like that, the less people are going to accept it as a real thing. It's becoming a mockery to believe in that.
Well, both of you gentlemen have had a real hand in persuading me we need to speed up our project to develop a book on UFOs.
Right.
You know, as you pointed out, Mark, we've been relying on the video for too long. And you were the one that came to me and says, Hugh, when's the book going to come out? And I said, well, I've got all these other book projects that are kind of ahead of it. And that's when you volunteered, and then Ken joined in with his research on UFOs and said, let's get it out faster.
Right.
So the 3 of us writing it, it is going to happen faster. But I think a context for this is that if you've been watching us so far, you might get the idea that we're a group of scholars that is going to debunk the whole UFO thing. That's not the take. It wasn't the take 4 years ago. We are saying that most of it is something that should not be given any credence. What we said 4 years ago, 98% of all UFOs that are reported turn out not to be UFOs. But there's a residual, and it's a residual that needs some attention. And frankly, our U.S. government is not giving it the attention that it deserves, mainly because it falls outside of their immediate government interests, which I can appreciate.
And also funding priorities too. Yeah, exactly.
But this is something that people are intensely interested in, more so overseas than here. I remember the first time I went to Russia back in 1990 to speak to university audiences, and all they wanted to hear about was what I had to say as a Western astronomer, Western science astronomer, on the subject of UFOs. I think I gave 18 lectures on UFOs in 10 days.
Was it that many?
Wow.
And I discovered that people in Russia were far more interested in the subject than we are. But interest here is picking up.
It is.
And there's some reasons why it's picking up. I wanted us to talk about that and then also communicate what's new.
Sure. Well, also, I'm glad that Ken's in on it because he's brought some research himself to this table, I think, and from a philosophic perspective, one that is very interesting and complements, I think, the project that we're attempting too.
I think there's a real need for providing a frame of reference in which to look at this whole phenomenon. Obviously, there are people in the scientific community that give it no credence at all, and there is some legitimate evidence of a UFO reality. On the other hand, I meet Christians all the time who are not quite sure what to do with this phenomenon. It opens up all kinds of questions about life on other planets and things of that nature. But certainly a very critical look at the phenomenon, but also exploring it from a theological point of view and seeing what the implications really are.
I think it's going to be a useful project. Should we give a minute or two to the so-called UFO passages in the Bible? Do you think we need to spend time with that? What's the biggest challenge that we get there?
Well, I think people want to see some really hard scientific evidence that this is not just some kind of hoax or farce, or there's nothing to it. And said there is a 2% residual that defies any kind of possible explanation. And people want that to be dealt with. I think that's what we have to offer here at Reasons to Believe, is a unique perspective on what's really going on. You've been watching us for any length of time. It's rather obvious we do not believe it's little green women from Planet X.
Right.
That's probably the most popular explanation of UFOs that's out there in the arena, public arena.
Right.
And we got some good material on why that's not a credible answer to that 2% of the UFO phenomena. In fact, we can make even a stronger statement. It's not physical, period.
Right. It is real.
It is real,
but
not physical.
Right.
Now, once you bring up that subject of real but not physical, a lot of skepticism comes to the front. But what we've been doing here at Reasons to Believe is say, in fact, that's kind of the heart of our ministry.
It sure is.
There are new scientific discoveries that reveal that non-physical reality is a fact of life.
Exactly.
That's how the universe was created.
The whole creation of the universe came from something that we cannot detect by the five senses.
Right. The space-time theorem of general relativity, this 10-dimensional creation discovery we've been talking about, demonstrates that there must be an entity working in non-physical reality that brought the universe into existence. Well, once we have established that by hard science, literally to 14 places the decimal in case of the demonstration of the space-time theorem of general relativity, that opens up the possibility that there may be other experiences under the classification of non-physical reality. So scientifically, we need to be at least open to that possibility. And then that says, all right, given that we have non-physical reality, let's find out as much as we can about it. And science has got a lot to say today, the last couple of years, on how to frame what's going on in the arena of non-physical reality. And that gives us a whole new take on UFOs. And then when we discover that certain kinds of people have UFO encounters, others don't.
Well, this is the unique, I think, hypothesis that you've come up with back in the early 70s, isn't it? And maybe we ought to restate that, because I think that's one of the most unique things I've ever heard from this ministry.
And one of the things I discovered when I was a graduate student is that the people that should be seeing UFOs don't see them. Astronomers are spending thousands of hours observing the heavens, and the vast majority of them have never had any kind of UFO encounter. And yet you get people who are serious scholars who've spent a very limited time looking at the heavens, and they have all kinds of UFO encounters.
Exactly.
And then it was Hynek that came into the encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind, and you kind of alerted me to the value of having encounters of many different kinds instead of three kinds, several kinds.
The classifications have been increased to fourth and fifth kind, fourth being abduction, fifth being actual death. And I think this is where the Christian worldview has explanatory power. The Christian worldview is able to explain the physical world and the non-physical immaterial realm. Naturalism doesn't do a good job of it. The Eastern mysticism does not do a good job of it. The Christian worldview can explain not only the physical and non-physical realms, but also the best explanation of the UFO phenomenon.
Right. Yeah, that needs to get out there.
Yeah, it sure does.
And I think much more so overseas than here in America.
Yes.
I mean,
that's where we've seen the most sightings. Although in America, in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen a huge increase in the number of people dealing with this issue, or at least experiencing it in some way and reporting it.
Well, the fact that there's a tight correlation between the encounters of the different kinds and what kinds of people are having those various types of encounters tells us a lot. And that's what we'll be getting into in this new book, and maybe we can do a program in the future where we talk about that specifically, what kinds of people have which encounters. And that really goes a long ways to explaining what's behind the phenomena.
Yeah.
So
I think we're going to need to spend some time on that, because it's, you know, even though the case is closed now, you know there's going to be a lot more speculation.
Because the case really isn't closed.
It never is.
That's right.
There's people out there on that
So
issue. Good.
Appreciate the input you guys have on this.
Sure.
Thank you. Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we try to inform you about new evidences for the God of the Bible and the reliability of the Bible from the frontiers of scientific research. And just from what's happening in modern society as we listen to what questions people have about the Christian faith. We've been reviewing the 200 most frequently asked questions that are posed at our Reasons to Believe office and ministry. And once again, we have Ken Samples joining us, our Director of Publications, along with Mark Clark from Strategic Studies at California
State University,
San Bernardino. Right.
I'm glad Ken's on because Ken's been, I think, brings to the table a lot of good qualities. When we talked last time, he gave his testimony and some of his background and his trainings in philosophy. And that really complements, I think, the ministry because you go at it from a very scientific perspective and you give a lot of the physical evidences that come out. And Ken can bring in that philosophic worldview kind of perspectives. And mine is on the political side. You know, what is the implication of this for society and culture and things like that? So I think we can kind of zero in on some of the implications of these things. But Hugh, I think today, don't we have a very interesting topic to discuss?
We do. I mean, our whole Reasons to Believe ministry is focusing on apologetics, giving a reasoned answer for the faith that we hold to. And there's a couple of new developments. I shouldn't say new, it's always been around, but it's getting a lot more attention today in terms of Christian apologetics, where people think they've discovered some new proofs for the Christian faith that from our perspective really aren't valid. And so we want to talk about what this new movement's all about and why we can definitively challenge this as an approach for trying to give secular people reasons for the Christian faith. I think we have much superior ways that God has given us and endorsed. And what we're talking about is this movement of finding these secret codes embedded within the biblical text, either looking at the words that you see, the Hebrew and Greek words in the text, or the sequence of the Greek and Hebrew letters that fall in the text, and looking for some secret message and saying, voila, we find this message here, and this is statistically incredible that this message could be embedded in the text. This must be another way that God is communicating to us, and it's another proof that this book we call the Bible is the error-free Word of God. And I know both of you gentlemen have given some study to this, and in fact we got a number of books here that are promoting this view, and this is happening more and more, especially on Christian radio and television, and I think there needs to be a response from the thinking Christian community on what we should do with this. How can we tell people that this is not a credible way to go? I think in the last 6 months we've received a couple of hundred letters, people asking us for help.
Yeah,
how to deal with this.
And there's a lot that comes in on that all the time. And Ken, you've done some research on this. Do you want to kind of give a couple of things that you can talk about on this subject?
Sure. I think it's Hugh. I think your point is a good one, and that is when we defend the Christian faith and we give reasons for faith, we want to make sure that the reasons we give are good ones.
Right.
We don't want to defend the faith and then have it find out that our reasons are not sound. So I'm not criticizing people who want to encourage people to take the Bible seriously, but we need to do it in a way in which it'll stand up. And in terms of a Bible code, I think the problem, and there are a number of problems with this, one of the problems is it kind of turns the Bible into a mystery book. That is, rather than being a direct revelation from God, where God speaks clearly and significantly to His people, it becomes somewhat of a Bible that's filled with esoteric or hidden truths. In that way, it's not all that different from a heresy of the first century called Gnosticism, where Christians were not Christians if they believed the gospel, but they had to have a certain secret truth. And this opens up further problems. The nature of the Bible itself. The Bible is a historical document. The New Testament came into being through a historical process. We need to be very careful that we don't change the Bible in its genre from a historical document to somehow some esoteric secret document. So interpreting the Bible is very important. We want to take the Bible as in its most literal sense, and what I mean by that, we want to interpret the Bible according to its literary genre. If it's a parable, we treat it as a parable. If it is a historical narrative, we treat it as a historical narrative. But to go off looking for secret codes and things of that nature, I think it even loses the intention of Scripture.
Well, I think the Lord has anticipated this in the sense that He has already put within the pages of the Bible the apologetic paths that we should pursue. He has told us how to defend the Christian faith, how to argue for the Christian faith, you make the point the Bible is an historical document. The Bible is constantly appealing to historical evidences to verify that this message is true.
And we see
likewise in the arena of science, it does the same thing. The heavens declare the glory of God.
Exactly.
Look at the heavens and you'll see God's message there. But nowhere in the Bible does it tell us to look for secret codes.
That's right. And in fact, if people are looking for a biblically sound, statistically sound apologetic, they can look to the messianic prophecies that are fulfilled in Christ, because the apostles, one of their major arguments that Christ is the Messiah is that Jesus has fulfilled these prophetic prophecies. We need not turn to kind of a mystical, esoteric interpretation.
In fact, you've written extensively on this. How could it possibly occur? A number of prophecies occur. The statistical likelihood of them occurring by random chance it's just so remote as to be virtually impossible.
Well, from a scientist's perspective, my criticism of this Bible code apologetic approach is that in spite of their claims that it's statistically significant, when you really put it in its appropriate context, there is no statistical significance whatsoever.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think that's, you know, for people who are not trained in statistics, you know, that there's in fact a very good book that I used at graduate school, How to Lie with Statistics.
How to Lie with Statistics.
And it was in a joke title, but it was intended to convey a thing, that a purpose, that if you don't follow a particular methodology, there's a lot of things you can convey with statistics that are in fact not true.
Right. Well, I think Ken here has given us a good model of comparison. The Bible does encourage us to appeal to probability with fulfilled prophecy.
Okay.
You know, there are 230 predictions in the Bible about the coming of the Messiah and what he will do. I think it's 330.
Yes.
330, and Jesus fulfilled 109 of them in his first coming, and has promised to fill the other 220 in his second coming. And the appeal we have in Scripture is the statistical likelihood of one man, without any help from God, fulfilling on his own these 109 prophecies is so utterly remote that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, really must be the Messiah, the one who created the universe.
Exactly.
And so that's an example of a biblically endorsed statistical approach to demonstrate the Christian faith. But the problem with Bible codes is it doesn't have that same statistical power. I think an easy way to explode this is that with fulfilled prophecy, you're told what to look for.
You're given a hint where to go.
X will be fulfilled at this time in this place. And so you have a narrowly defined characteristic to search for. The problem with the Bible code methodology is to say, look, we found this message embedded in the text, and the statistical likelihood of that happening is astronomically remote. It's astronomically remote. That's the only possible message you could search for.
But that's the problem, isn't it?
It's not.
The only you can.
There are thousands, if not millions, of messages that would be considered to be significant if discovered.
Right.
And so instead of searching for one variable, in fact, you're searching for millions of variables.
Right.
And therefore, the probability of you finding one of those millions of variables is extremely high. Whereas the probability of finding one variable and only one possible variable is extremely low. And so in the case of fulfilled prophecy, we've got a legitimate application of probability theory establishing the Christian faith. With the Bible codes, people are deceiving the public in thinking the variable size is 1, when in fact the variable size is huge.
It's huge.
And a good demonstration of that is that this methodology has been exploited, not just by Christians to argue for the truth of the Bible. It's been an argument exploited by many cults and followers of other religions.
And even bad education. I remember a case was trying to be made back in the 80s, and it's not hit the headlines, but there was an argument that there was a strong correlation between paperclip production in the United States and racial repression in South Africa. Now, sure, it may be true that those two coincided, but what was the likelihood? What's the commonsensical likelihood of those two being connected? Zero.
False
Nothing.
cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so, yeah, these kinds of things can happen, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily related.
And with that paperclip example, if it was thumbtacks instead of paper clips, they would have drawn the same conclusion, right?
Exactly. Well, see, that's something they didn't look
Big
for.
variable size.
That's right.
And so I think the advice to people being presented with these apologetic tools is find out what the variable size is.
Okay.
Another factor is the sample size. If you're dealing with a very large sample, and with the Bible you are, there's a lot of letters in the Bible, a lot of words in the Bible.
Right.
Nearly 1 million words in the Old and New Testament, and each word has 5 or 6 letters. And so you got this huge sample size. And where the sample size is very large and the variable size is likewise very large, the probability of finding some kind of code is virtually a certainty.
Mm-hmm. But the probability of finding a lot of those is pretty high.
Not just
over
one
time.
code, you should find
Multiple
several.
codes.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that this has been done with other books, the Bible is not the only book that has delivered codes of this nature. In fact, any book exceeding a couple 100,000 words has a decent chance of producing at least 1 or 2 codes.
Okay.
And so, for example, you have Muslim apologists saying, we know the Quran must be the Word of God because of this repeating pattern of 19
Okay.
that comes through the text. Well, the Quran is not as big a book as the Bible, but it's big enough that it has a statistical high probability of providing a number of codes.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they claim a code from their book is not at all surprising.
Right.
You can do this with any book, and it's been done. I mean, with the Vedas, etc., the same tactic's been used. So the fact that the Bible is not unique in producing these kinds of claims should give us pause in terms of, is this really a credible approach? I think you could do it with a phone book. I mean,
I'm sure you could.
Encyclopedia, any book.
Isn't the advertisement, if you can't find it in here, it doesn't exist?
Well, this could lead to some
even if you do find it in there, it
poor
probably doesn't
advertising
exist.
for
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's probably the most
Commonsensical.
scientific, mathematical way of exposing what's really going on here.
Okay.
And I don't think it's just Bible codes. I mean, I got some books here where people are claiming that God embedded the gospel message in the constellation star patterns we see in the heavens. And we're aware as Christians that the Bible condemns the practice of astrology. But what a number of Christians in the evangelical community are trying to promote is this idea, well, yeah, astrology is bad, but astrology is a perversion of something that's good. That before astrology came along, God had this message embedded in the constellations.
Right.
And his intent was that we would look at those star patterns, we would be able to read the gospel in those star patterns and come to a saving knowledge of faith. And that what the astrologers did is take God's good message and perverted it. Well, again, there's nothing in the Bible endorsing us to look at the star patterns to find truth. That's not in there. So that should make us cautious. The Bible does not endorse this apologetic approach. But then from an astronomer's perspective, can you really trust star patterns? And I think a good example of this from my own field is there was a famous astronomer when I was a graduate student by the name of Schmidt-Kahler. And he was running around the country giving lectures and publishing articles claiming that he had found these perfect circular patterns of stars. In other words, he would find a bunch of stars distributed in a perfect circle around a central point. And he was convinced, and he did some statistical tests on this. What's the probability of getting a group of stars into a perfect circle? And he discovered that the probability was incredibly remote. So he said, this must be physically significant. And he developed a theory that there was some kind of ancient star explosion in the center of the circle that blew out this ring of gas. And millions of years later, that ring would spawn all these new stars. That explains the perfect circle. And I remember a few astronomers being a little bit critical, saying, well, that gas isn't going to move out at the same velocity in all different directions. This doesn't seem quite right. But Schmidt-Kahler would always go back and say, but we have these perfect circles. If that's not the physical answer, there must be another physical explanation. Now, this is all happening the days before we had very sophisticated computers. And this was all put to rest by an enterprising graduate student who got the money to run a computer program where he would dump out at random 2 million different star positions on a piece of paper. And then he looked for geometric patterns.
Right.
And he found better circles than Schmidt-Kahler found.
Oh, really?
Wow.
All at
And so
random.
by the sheer numbers of stars in the heaven, you're
Well,
going to see these patterns.
Again, to expose the statistical flaw here, Schmidt-Kahler probably would have considered perfect triangles as something significant,
Oh,
or
okay.
perfect octagons, or hexagons, or
Rectangles or
squares, I mean,
something.
whatever.
Okay.
There was all kinds of different geometric patterns that would have been considered significant. And then the sizes of the circles. I mean, he was only looking for circles of a certain size. That'd be another matter. But the fact that all different kinds of sizes of circles would be appropriate in all different kinds of star cluster situations meant that the variable size certainly wasn't one, it was quite large. And then look at the size of the sample. I mean, as graduate students simply put out 2 million stars on a sheet of paper at random. Well, how many stars do we have in the actual universe? Well, in our galaxy, there are over 200 million stars. 200 billion, pardon me, 200 billion stars.
Than that, yeah.
And we can image these stars quite easily with telescopes. And therefore, the probability of finding these circles is very high, just based on
The sheer volume.
statistical coincidence.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to analyze all of these claims. You know, is there? And, you know, when you look at the constellations, the thing that amazed me about astrology when I was reading about it as a little kid was that guy thinks there's a woman sitting on a chair. All I see is a big W up there. And obviously what was going on is they had developed a theology, and then they looked up at the stars and said, well, let's find the star patterns that best fits the story we want to tell.
Well, this is something that I wanted to bring up, and I think Ken's done some work on, is doesn't this lead into, or doesn't it parallel or walk alongside of some occultic practices that we see out there? And is that a cause for concern for those who are advocating this as a proof for the Christian faith? I mean, aren't we getting ourselves into trouble, or can we get ourselves into trouble by this?
Yeah, I think 2 points need to be made. Number one, there is solid scientific, historical, and prophetic evidence for the Christian faith. We don't have to go on to the more speculative areas. We don't have to push and emphasize points that are not sound. We need to do a good job in our apologetic. But this idea of kind of a mystical interpretation using numbers and symbols has had a long history. I think of the Jewish tradition and the practice of the Kabbalah, where the emphasis in reading Scripture is not the literal historical interpretation of the time, but a mystical interpretation based upon a numeric viewpoint. And I see all of this as distraction, because the Bible was written with an intention. John says in John 20, these things were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.
That's a big problem. If you're looking for these mystical interpretations, you're not paying attention to the message that's there and clear and evident.
And Jesus did not emphasize the idea of the numerical codes or the various patterns in the sky. Jesus said to the Pharisees, when you look to the Old Testament, when you look to the law, the prophets, and the writings, the 3 divisions of the Old Testament, they speak about me. And so I think it's distraction. It takes the focus off of what the Christian revelation should be, and that's always Jesus Christ.
Well, let me suggest another danger. This idea that there's some kind of secret embedded code or some message that we can read in the star patterns, I think is an appeal to human pride. You know, I'm smart enough to find this. The rest of you have to come to me to figure this out. Whereas when you look at the pages of the Bible, it's always an appeal to humility.
Right.
God has clearly and forthrightly declared, if you're humble enough, you'll recognize that He is speaking to you. I mean, this doesn't take special wisdom, it doesn't take special intellect or education. This is out there for us to read, and it's available to all, not to just a privileged few. So I think whenever you see an apologetic approach that appeals to intellectual snobbery or a secret club.
So that's what starts scaring me, because you start getting into that approach that the ancient Egyptians and others, in fact all the ancient religions always had, you know, that cult of priesthood, that they have the select mysteries and you have to come to them. It's a way of enforcing political power and holding the reins of power in your hands.
2 Timothy 3, Paul tells Timothy that from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures that are able to do what? To make you wise unto salvation. And the church had to battle against the Gnostic cult in the first century, a group of a mystical approach to religion that said only certain individuals have a secret access to Christianity. And I think things like this need to be exposed as not being sound. We want to argue in a way that the skeptics can examine our arguments and see that they are sound.
Right.
And these kinds of things just don't stand up to scrutiny.
Well, I don't want to be too harsh on the evangelicals that are promoting all of this. One thing I will say to their credit, they do admit that this is a weak apologetic approach compared to fulfilled prophecy, the scientific evidences for the creation. Right. They admit that, the testimonial evidences, right, etc. I think what we're saying is, well, given that we all recognize, even those that are promoting this, that this is a weak apologetic approach at best, then surely we should be emphasizing the approaches that are promoted in Scripture.
Right.
No one questions their intent. Their motive is to honor Christ.
Right.
We just want to do it in a way that will stand up.
Well, and I'm also, I mean, and I appreciate what you're both saying, but I would also add a caveat, and that is that, you know, where are wolves in sheep's clothing going to come in except through areas like that? I mean, untestable, unprovable areas. I'm not saying that these folks are the Christian apologists, but, you know, if occultic members can get in, they can present the message. And I know the New Age does. I mean, this is a huge thing in the New Age, that, you know, our reality is not real reality. The real reality is a mystical one, and there are ways to get to that. And are we not, you know, these kinds of things that are not provable and not testable can lead us along that. And Christ, you know, and through Paul in Thessalonians says, test every spirit, for not every spirit's from God. So a truth that comes through the Scripture is going to be testable in either historic or physical terms, and not rely on, you know, someone's interpretation.
Yeah, it kind of takes away your power to reach people in the cults and other religions. I mean, how can I appeal to a Muslim who says, well, I got this number 19 pattern coming through the Quran?
Exactly.
You know, if I can show him that that is a weak apologetic approach and is statistically insignificant, and here's a better way to establish what is true, then I got something going. But he says, hey, you're just using the same thing from your Bible, then I got no power to reach him for Christ.
Right.
I think another way this can be tested is you can take this stuff like the gospel and the stars, or the witness of arithmetic to Christ, or, you know, God's voice in the stars, or this message that we see embedded in Genesis, and say, how is that fared in terms of reaching people for faith in Christ amongst secular scholars and really getting them? The truth is, it's had very little fruit.
If any, right? Yeah.
If you try this on people that are mathematically inclined, they realize this is statistically bogus.
Right.
And so the fact that this isn't bearing fruit, it might be bearing fruit within the Christian community of persuading them that God is really speaking, but in terms of where it really counts, it's not paying off, whereas the methods that the Bible has told us to use do pay off.
And they do bear fruit. In fact, you have a recent story about that, don't you? You went up to UC Davis, and there was, I think, a Jewish astronomer up there, wasn't there? I don't remember exactly, but there was a case in which someone who was never considered these claims before began to seriously consider them based on the physical evidence that was out there.
Yeah, once he saw that there was credible scientific evidences for the creation event and the design of the universe and of life, for the first time as an atheist, he began to rethink his position.
Yeah.
So.
And that's the way to go, I think.
Sure.
This also detracts, I think, from Christianity's most unique point among the world's religions. In the Eastern religion, there is the mystical.
It's all mystical, isn't it?
It is virtually all mystical. Christianity appeals to the historical, factual nature of the revelatory events in the Bible. And to distract from that and to go to the mystical is to leave one of our best selling points, that the Bible is opened alongside the pages of Western civilization.
Christian faith is the only faith amongst the world's religions that can be rested on objective evidences.
That's right.
Well, you know, I remember as an undergraduate student in history years ago, professors who were clearly not Christian, or at least not interested in it, pointed to the book of Luke and said this is one of our best historical documents from the early Roman Empire period. It had more accurate details about the life of individuals than any other text we have, including the writings of political leaders at the time. Well, I mean, with that's powerful evidence to go back in a historical record and look at books such as Luke and others, and use that for a basis for evaluating both what happened in the Bible, but also what happened in the history around it.
Yep, and I
Yes.
see that in departments of physics where people say the Bible is an amazing book, loaded with cosmology.
Yeah.
And it's correct. And that catches their attention. See, God already told us thousands of years ago, these are the tools we should use.
Yeah.
So,
Gave us all the hints and the directions, but we just, to our peril, have ignored it at times.
sure.
Well, I appreciate, Ken, what you brought to our attention today, because I think it's important to discuss, and I'm glad you brought your the points about the statistical anomalies and fallacies that are involved in it, because I think it'll help our audience be a little bit better prepared to at least answer the objections and questions that people may have from these views.
Sure.
Yeah.
Christians need to be thinkers, use the mind that God has given them.
And there's plenty of tools available. I mean, these things are not hard to find out, are they?
Well, it's like that book you were talking about, How to Lie with Statistics. I mean, something like that, written from a secular mathematician's point of view, really helps us
Yeah.
to determine, where is it appropriate to use it, where is it not appropriate to use it. And it really is a great support
Yeah.
to biblical evidences.
And those kinds of books are out there and are available, and they don't require 10 years of college mathematics to understand.
You don't have to be a mathematician, just use common sense and logic.
Good.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we attempt to keep you up to date on the latest discoveries that are revealing new evidences for the God of the Bible and the reliability of the Bible. And we've been interspersing these discussions about new evidences for the Christian faith with a response to the 200 most frequently asked questions that are presented to us at our Reasons to Believe ministry. Questions from skeptics and secularists considering or questioning the Christian faith. And Mark, what do we have on board for us today in that department?
Well, one of the top 20 questions that we get is, what is this about creation or evolution? What's the truth? What's going on here? And then there's a couple of corollary questions that come out of that we can ask along the way. But how do you want to take this? Because this is such a broad
Well, I think the way I've heard it most frequently, especially on university campuses and even in churches, doesn't evolution refute the Christian faith?
Okay.
And so there's a lot of confusion about the creation-evolution debate that's running on and how powerful the evidences for evolution are, and do they really refute the Christian faith, or only parts of the Christian faith or not at all. And there's been a lack of good answers on that. And I think what I want to emphasize in giving a short response to this question, I mean, we've discussed this at length in previous episodes.
And plenty of episodes spent a lot of time on it.
And there's a lot of resources on this. Is that you want to first establish where people are coming from.
Okay.
And so...
are you talking about the individuals who are promoting particular views?
Well, people are making the comment, doesn't evolution refute the Christian faith?
Right.
And we've produced a little free sheet called, the shell game of creation evolution.
Right.
What we try to do there is say, all right, first you want to establish definitions.
Okay. Now this is important because what a shell game does is you try to hide the little pea that's underneath the shell, so by switching of hands. So is that what's happening here to some extent?
You're a political scientist, and I think first of all we need to expose the political games that are going on in this debate before we get into the scientific evidences and the biblical response. And the way I see this shell game being played out, high school, junior high, college level, is they begin by saying, well, of course, we all know that evolution's a proven fact. It's established beyond any reasonable doubt. And what they're talking about there is the fact that we have solid evidences that the natural world has changed with respect to time. Life has changed, our solar system has changed, the universe has changed, the sun's changing, etc. We can watch this all going on, and there's no doubting the fact that this is going on.
Well, then the political the implication that flows from that is, well, if that's true, then the Christian faith is wrong because it's positing something
Well, the way
else.
they play the game is they play a shell game with the definition. They change the definition hidden under that shell.
Okay.
They don't tell you they've changed the definition. And they, I think you've stated it right. We have all this proof, scientific proof, that evolution is beyond doubt true. And therefore we're justified in saying that life erodes naturally under these evolutionary processes and change naturally into human beings. We evolved from the amoeba. Now, what they've done is they've changed the definition of evolution without being explicit in their change in that definition.
Well, let's go back and give a basic definition of evolution and then look at some of these definitions as we go and see if we can spot the pea under the shell as it's
Well, I think the
changing.
way you can spot the peas, you notice they use the word change naturally,
Okay.
arose naturally. In the first definition, that adjective wasn't there. Okay, we just made the observation. Look at the world, it changes with time. It changes over long periods of time.
Okay.
So that's been going on. And
That's a broad definition of evolution, change with respect to time. isn't
change with respect to time. That's kind of a basic physics definition of evolution. Things change with respect to
it?
time.
We can see that in our own bodies,
Sure.
families, everything, political
But
cultures.
the problem with the second definition is that now you're stating that the changes are taking place naturally.
Okay.
The first definition was theologically neutral. There was no attempt to attribute the cause for the change.
Okay.
You could have, with that first definition, could have been God engineering the change, or natural process, or a combination.
Or man, or other things
Whatever,
too. I mean, there's
yeah.
a lot of things that could be agent.
The second definition was explicit about what was responsible for the changes.
Okay.
These are changes going on naturally, strictly natural processes.
Without respect to God being the causal
Right.
agent.
And what you're implying there is that God's not involved.
Right.
Now you've got something that's theologically threatening to Christians in particular. And that's, secularists that can't understand why these Christians are getting so upset at this proven fact.
Sure.
The reason they're getting upset is that you've changed the definition of evolution.
Right.
Now you're implying that God's not involved at all. It's all natural process. And this is something that's consistent with atheistic materialism, but it's not consistent with Christian theism.
Well, I'm glad you put it as the shell game, because isn't that the kind of the thing that happens is that at a shell game you're frustrated because you know that where you thought you saw something happening, all of a sudden it's been changed.
It's been
the trick.
changed.
It's a sleight of hand.
It's a sleight of hand, a hidden change in the definition. Now, I would argue that we see the same sleight of hand going on with the term creation.
How so?
Well, secular society is fond of defining creation and belief in God as the concept that God creates a universe and all life within it in a context no more than about 6,000 years.
Okay, the young Earth.
The chronology of Archbishop Usher,
Right.
4004 BC, God creates the universe, and 6 days later he creates Adam.
Right.
And then they'll make the comment, well, we all know that that's scientifically ridiculous. We have overwhelming scientific proof that that's not true. And since that's not true, there's no basis for belief in God or belief in the Bible or belief in Adam and Eve. And all of that should be chalked up to wishful thinking and myth. And
Well, that's a straw man argument, isn't it? You take the weakest argument of your opponent, set it up, knock it down, because it's easy to knock down,
Right.
and then claim you've decimated the opponent, but in fact that's not true.
Or I think another term is marginalize. You pick an extremely marginal position within a very
Large community.
large community.
Okay.
You say, since that's the easiest one to knock down, we'll assume, and what they're trying to do is communicate to people, everyone who believes in God or creation believes that it happened on a time scale 6,000 years.
Right, okay.
And since we know that's not true, there is no scientific basis for believing
We
in
can
God or
reject the
believing in the
entire
Bible. We
package.
can reject that.
Okay.
And of course, what are we left with? Atheistic materialism. And what's really going on in terms of public education is a skillful, deceptive attempt to establish only one religion in our community,
Right.
the religion of atheistic materialism.
Exactly. Well, this kind of brings up an interesting question. I mean, the Supreme Court has made some kind of statement on this, and is it the case that the Supreme Court ruling on the role of science and creation prohibits us from saying anything about issues relating to
Well,
faith?
that's another myth. I think you get it all the time when you're
Sure.
teaching at Cal State San Bernardino. You run into professors, and in the high schools it's worse, and junior high worse again. Teachers who come from a Christian perspective feel that by law they're restricted from making any connection between their subject material and their Christian faith. And they say, well, the First Amendment says the separation of church and state.
Right.
And we're not allowed to promote church within our secular...
Governmental, yeah, right. Anything that's government finance funded.
Exactly, and that's out of bounds.
Right.
And so we have teachers obeying laws as if this was a Soviet Russia, where we're forbidden from promoting any religion except the religion of atheistic materialism. And we need to realize that that First Amendment was penned. I mean, you're much more skilled at this than I am, but that the intent of the Constitution was to guarantee freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
Exactly.
There's a big difference.
It's a huge difference.
And nothing within this creation-evolution debate really promotes one denomination over another. I think that's what the founding fathers of our nation were concerned about. They didn't want the government involved in making an alliance with a particular denomination.
That's exactly what was involved because of the Church of England experience and the place.
Right, what was going on in Europe.
Absolutely, yeah.
Or for that matter, the state of Maryland.
That's true.
I think that, amendment was aimed at the state of Maryland.
You could be right about that. That's a good point.
That we don't want the Maryland experiment being proliferated throughout the states of the Union.
Sure.
So, and suddenly it's being misinterpreted in our day that we're not allowed to talk about God at all, can't post the Ten Commandments,
right?
Can't talk about creation.
And there's a few court rulings that come out and make it look that way, but it kind of goes back and forth. This battle is not yet settled, but there is a Supreme Court ruling. What does it say with respect to that
Well, I think
issue?
that's part of the myth. People have this idea that, because, you know, the creation-evolution issue was tried in court 3 times. Most recently in Arkansas and Louisiana.
Correct.
And people go back to that Arkansas, Louisiana case and say that forbade the teaching of creation in the public school arena. What they're not aware of is that court case was dealing with what has been popularly termed scientific creationism.
Or creation science?
Or creation science.
Right, I've heard it several different ways.
And what that really is this Archbishop Usher stuff.
Right, the
6,000 to 10,000 years ago,
Correct.
God creates the universe. And the scientific community just said, we can't let that into the public education arena.
Because it's so against everything that we've seen in the sciences and the evidence of the natural world that it is a logical absurdity. And
yeah, we're asking students literally to reject everything within the realm of established science, and they saw that, I think, quite correctly as something that shouldn't be tolerated.
Right.
I mean, as Christians of all people, we should insist that truth be taught and not untruth or lies. In fact, there's a recent book called Telling Lies for God, which kind of critiques that whole movement.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Ian Plimmer down in Australia, he's a geologist.
Okay.
But you know, I'm ashamed that it took an atheist geologist down there in Australia
to look at this and
to expose this problem within the Christian community. In one sense, I think we got ourselves to blame that we're being shut out of public education. But I think, you know, let's look at this statement, because it's not really true that the Louisiana Balanced Treatment Act shut out the discussion of creation, or for that matter, evolution, from the public education arena.
This is in 1987.
1987, and this is where the coming into a school with a creation science curriculum was forbidden.
Okay, and that's specifically the 4004 BC creation event time.
In that sense, that's the third shell game.
Okay.
People say, since the Louisiana Supreme Court forbade the teaching of creation science in the public education arena, therefore we can conclude that any discussion of creation is forbidden from the public education arena.
Okay.
No, it went after one scientifically provable Christian position within the much larger realm of Christian positions on creation evolution. It's another shell game.
Okay.
And we got to call these, I mean, people are playing political games, and we need to call them on it.
Yeah.
But here's what, this is an excerpt. It's not the whole statement. You can get the whole statement if you want it. But here's a couple of excerpts that I think bring balance to this whole situation. I'm just going to quote it directly. It says, "It is equally clear that requiring schools to teach creation science with evolution does not advance academic freedom. The Act does not grant teachers a flexibility that they did not already possess to supplant the present science curriculum with a presentation of theories besides evolution about the origin of life." In other words, I'm just breaking from the quote here.
Sure.
It's making the point, we don't need a law guaranteeing protection of the right to discuss issues on creation. It already exists. We don't need a new law. We already have within our public education system the stated freedoms to bring up these subjects and to discuss them. And so we don't have to protect these rights because they're already
already
guaranteed.
exist.
Let me continue. Indeed, the Court of Appeals found that no law prohibited Louisiana public school teachers from teaching any scientific theory. As the president of the Louisiana Science Teachers Association testified, any scientific concept that's based on established fact can be included in our curriculum already, and no legislation allowing this is necessary. The Act provides Louisiana school teachers with no new authority. Now, I think the critical thing to pick up on that statement is says you've got the right to present any theory on creation or evolution, provided it's based on established fact.
Okay.
You can't go around telling people, for example, that the Earth is flat, and we have overwhelming proof that that's not true.
Correct.
So, somebody within the community of scholars has got to be willing to endorse this as being factual. And if they can do that, then you've got the freedom to present it. And sometimes there's debate on what's factual and not factual. That's okay too.
That's at the frontiers of science at all times.
That's what we talk
That's
about.
how knowledge is advanced. Right.
But to go around saying there is no law of gravity when clearly there is, I mean,
That's pretty absurd.
that's that's what we have these institutions for, where they have these special white jackets,
to
etc.
keep them on Earth. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, whatever.
Okay.
So, and there's a second paragraph that's within this. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origins of humankind to school children might be validly done with a clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science instruction. In other words, it's making the point that even if you had no theological motivation, this is valuable. It's part of our education process that people should be exposed to differing beliefs and interpretations. So in this sense, we have the freedom. As long as we're not trying to tell people that black is white and white is black.
Which is what the Bible suggests.
Which is reasonable.
Yeah,
I mean,
that makes sense.
the whole Christian faith is bound on the idea that objective, well-established facts support our beliefs.
Right.
So we, of all people, should be the ones who would be condemning anybody trying to promote something
That's
that can
scientifically
be
absurd.
that's scientifically absurd.
Where we saw it in Russia, didn't we? Didn't we see that several times with this particular atheistic interpretations of medicine, for example, was done. And it went and it produced a series of absurdities in Russian medical community and psychology, didn't it?
That's true.
And so in a sense, this is a good decision by the Supreme Court. It supports us. But the key is we as Christians have to become aware of these laws and keep our rights by exercising it.
Yeah, if we refuse to exercise our rights
It will be
to
eroded.
discuss these issues in the public education arena, it'll be assumed we don't have the rights.
Exactly.
So, and you've been very involved in this in your campus and other campuses.
And there's people that try to shut you down. There's no
Sure.
question. But that's different. I mean, that's just peer pressure. You can deal with that. It's on a different set of terms. It's not a legal issue.
But they can't throw you in jail for
No.
talking about issues of this matter.
Right, exactly.
So it's only if you're telling them that the moon is made out of green cheese are they going to get disturbed.
Well,
So-
unless you're being joking, I hope. Right. Well, there's one other little shell game that goes on, and I'm glad you brought this out, Hugh, but isn't it, we've talked about this before, the notion of micro versus macro evolution, what they were doing in that shell game, going back to it, in the first part where they said, well, see, we see evolution going on, therefore, boom, no Christian faith. That shell game is precisely jumping from one of those to the other, isn't it?
It is. The fact that we can demonstrate microevolution means that we have, I should restate it, the fact that we can demonstrate that microevolution goes on by strictly natural processes, therefore proves that it's going on the macro scale.
And see, that's the fallacy that goes
There's
on.
a fallacy there, right?
There's an exact fallacy, and
We have
that
evidence for one, but not the
that's
other.
the trick that people are pulling. And what that means is the microevolution, we see natural processes. I mean, I think we've talked about it before on this program, but we as humans have gotten a little bit sharper with our eyes in 2,000 years. There's minor changes that are going on at all times, but in no case does that make us turning into a cat or a lion or something else, is it?
Yeah, in one sense, our own species is rapidly evolving. I mean, we're taller today, we have better eyesight, but we're still human. We're not becoming elephants.
Right,
So
exactly. So macroevolution is not going on, but the microevolution is.
microevolution is going on. In some species, it's very hard to observe, but in other species, you can see it quite readily, and it goes on in real time. But to conclude from that you're going to get human beings from amoeba by natural processes over 3 billion years
It's pretty
doesn't follow.
problematic.
So,
Right.
one's been proven, the other hasn't been proven. Before we leave this, another shell game is this idea that somehow faith and science are mutually exclusive?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one that I personally struggled with when I was in graduate school, and that's a very good one. How do you deal with that? I mean, I know Christians struggle with that, don't they?
Well, let me play the rest of the game out. They'll say, since we all know that faith and science are mutually exclusive, therefore faith has no business in the science classroom.
Okay.
And so all faith issues are automatically removed from possible discussion. I see this particularly played out in the design argument. I mean, that's one of the things we do in Reasons to Believe, is demonstrate that when you look at the natural world, we see that it's been designed for life. People playing this faith-science shell game will say, well, wait a minute. Design arguments, that's faith, that has no role in science. We're not going to discuss that. And therefore, the atheist is able to protect himself or herself from scientific critique, because we're not even going to allow that evidence to be tried in court. I mean, if you're a lawyer, the thing you want to do is keep out from the court the evidences that are going to go against you.
Absolutely. That's what every good lawyer tries to do.
Right.
And good lawyers are strictly just good debaters. I mean, and sometimes using logical fallacies as well. But
sure.
Right, exactly. It's the same thing that's going on here.
And some scientists are good lawyers.
That's true. Some political scientists are as well.
But I think we all agree that Western science was founded on the premise that we allow all the evidences to be considered. And but if you're playing these shell games, then that's not happening, and science suffers.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting you bring that up, because in point of fact, the secularist, the atheistic materialist, often brings up their own version of theology. And I mean, it is a theology in one sense. You know, this natural process is the God of their religion, chance and random chance.
Yeah,
and
if you're an atheist, you're promoting the religion that God doesn't exist.
Exactly, and that is it's not a religiously neutral position, it's a religiously positive position. Only it's a positive against us, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also in the whole origins of the universe question, it's got a lot of cosmology, and it was cosmology, but dealing with the origin of the universe and the role God may or may not play in it.
Well, I try to turn the tables totally. It's not that faith and science are mutually exclusive. I don't think it's even accurate that they merely overlap. I think they're totally overlapping.
Well, how would you express that? I mean, what
Well, one way I could express it is you will not, I would challenge you to name a significant scientific fact that doesn't have theological implications. Likewise, I would say, take a significant doctrine of the Bible and find one that doesn't have significant scientific implications. There's nothing of any import within theology that's not also scientific. Likewise, there's nothing within science that is significant that doesn't have theological import. And what we're trying to promote through Reasons to Believe is that science and theology need to get along, they need to work together. They're working in the same arena. And
we're dealing with ultimate issues. I remember Ken Samples, who was on in a couple of previous shows, talked about that.
Yeah, philosophers ask the big questions, but so do theologians, so do scientists.
So do scientists. When they're talking about cosmology, they're talking about the origins, and that gets down to life purposes. Why are we here? And all those kinds of questions that can lead people to faith in Christ. Do you think it's a way to keep people out of the debate that they don't want in the debate?
It's a way to keep people out of the debate they don't want in. It's also a way to keep out evidences you really don't want to consider.
Right. Like the evidences that you bring up here in Reasons to Believe all the time.
Well, once you get onto theological turf, you make people uncomfortable. Okay, if I have to admit to certain truths, that means I have to change my worldview or theology, and maybe I'm in an emotional frame of mind or psychological frame of mind where that would be very disturbing for me. I'm not prepared to do it, and so I erect defenses.
Okay.
I mean, we all do that. We do that in our marriages, family relationships, etc. Things that we find unpleasant.
We try to track barriers and protective devices for them.
Right. But maturity is one of getting past that, saying, all right, this is going on in my life, and I know it's uncomfortable, but I'm not going to mature unless I get past these barriers. And as unpleasant as it is, I need to expose myself to all of this. I mean, how did we become Christians except by facing that which is unpleasant?
Right.
So
Winston Churchill had a great line once. He said, you must face facts, for they face you.
They face you.
They do face you at some point. Well, I think that's interesting, because what I see Reasons to Believe doing, and why I so strongly support it, is that you're attempting to heal that rift that's been around for 100+ years, 150 years maybe, in the science and faith community. I mean, that rift began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, didn't it?
Well, I think it began when people first started to play up the shell game. And what you had were scientists and theologians running away from one another. and the public kind of following suit, some going this path, some going the other path. But I think what's exciting is that we see advances in science that really build bridges
Right back
and
to
help this all come together. But if we don't expose these shell games, we're not even going to get to first base.
right.
And that's something anybody can do. You don't have to be a scientist or a theologian to say, hey, there's a shell game going on here.
Right.
Let's define our terms. We really can't discuss this issue intelligibly until we first define our terms. It doesn't make any, if you're using a different definition of evolution than I am, then for us to discuss issues doesn't really get us anywhere.
Or if I'm using two definitions without you knowing it, which is
Exactly.
what precisely the larger question gets to, is evolution versus creation. A lot of times they're using 2 to 3 different definitions of it, aren't they?
That's right.
Is there a specific definition that's more narrowly defined now? Would you call it Darwinian, Neo-Darwinian evolution? Is that something more specific?
Well, I would argue that there are over a dozen different definitions that have theological significance, different definitions of evolution.
Okay.
Likewise, of creation. I think that's critical too, because often in the secular environment is perceived as two polar extremes.
Right.
You've got atheistic materialism as one option on creation and evolution, and at the other end of the spectrum, you've got, say, young earth creationism, or the chronology of Archbishop Usher. And we need to be aware there are many different positions in between.
Isn't that always the case, though, that the polar extremes are the ones that shout the loudest, debate the longest and hardest, and most of the attention gets put on them? But that's not really the position of most people, is it?
Well, the thing I've observed is that atheists are secure debating young earth creationists, and young earth creationists are secure debating atheist materialists, but neither are secure dealing with the dozens of different positions that exist in the middle. And maybe what we need to do is just give more public exposure to these differing positions in the middle. I got a lot of criticism to say about them as well. I mean, I'm not saying that...
They're all right. They can't
right,
be.
they can't be.
Right.
I think that's part of it too. Somewhere in all of this, we have to say somebody's wrong and somebody's right, and that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I have to, at some point, be able to prove to you that what you believe is wrong and what I believe is right, or I got to admit that what I'm saying is wrong.
Right.
That's hard to do.
That gets in the area of humility and things that
Exactly.
none of us really like to deal with, isn't it?
That's why we need reasons to believe, right?
Exactly. Well,
All
thank you
right.
very much. You appreciate that
Okay.
discussion.
Been good.
Okay.
Welcome to Reasons to Believe, a program where we try to keep you up to date on the latest scientific evidences for the Christian faith and the reliability of the Bible. A program, too, where we try to expose you to the most frequently expressed objections to the Christian faith and how to develop brief answers to those responses, what we call the 200 most frequently posed questions. And we're going to look at those today as well. And Mark, what do we have?
Sure, Hugh. One of the things that we want to remind our audience is that we have a list of the 200 most frequently asked questions, but we don't actually have the responses because they were originally sent out, but they were such short ones that we decided instead to incorporate it on the television program to give a little bit more detail, a little more background, a little more resources for our audience to look for.
So the questions are available, but not the answers in
But
written
not the
form.
answers,
Not
right.
yet. I mean,
Not
that
yet.
will come.
That's coming
Right.
down the road,
Right.
but on the list of other projects to do, that's down the list. Okay. The question we have is one of the top 20 questions, Hugh, and I know you've dealt with this for years. In fact, this was kind of your quest, the beginning of your quest to become a Christian. And it is it possible for life to evolve by natural means? You know, that whole question we talked last time about the shell game of evolution and creation, and this kind of leads right into it.
Yeah, what I want to do is move us from the shell game where you're simply establishing definitions and what can be discussed and what can't be discussed in different arenas, as how do you actually get down to testing different interpretations on creation and evolution.
Okay.
And I guess what I want to state at the outset is that it's legitimate to conclude that something is evolving under strictly natural conditions, providing 4 requirements are met.
Okay, what are these 4 requirements?
Okay.
So these are accepted in scientific circles
Sure.
as well. Okay.
This is what you need to really say that this is something that's operating under natural process evolution.
Okay.
Number 1, you need to have established physical mechanisms that are capable of generating the changes.
Okay, can you give me an example of...
Well, yeah, I mean, we observe that a feather falls towards the center of the earth as you drop it. And the mechanism which generates that change from a position of height in the atmosphere to falling on the ground, we call gravity.
Okay.
And there are ways we can establish that this force of gravity is operating and is capable of generating these causes.
Okay.
So there's a case where we can establish that these physical mechanisms really do operate. They're part of what we would call the laws of physics that govern the universe.
Okay.
So show us the mechanism. If you can't provide a mechanism, a physical mechanism that can generate the change, then it's not legitimate to say that we have evidence this is happening under natural conditions.
Okay.
You know, show me the mechanism.
Right.
No mechanism, no theory.
I think it was in another movie said, show me the money, but here, show me the mechanism. That
Show me the
physicists-
mechanism.
Okay.
I want to see the mechanism that makes this happen.
Okay.
The second requirement is you must be able to demonstrate that this physical mechanism is capable of producing the changes under the observed physical conditions. In other words, you have the appropriate temperature and pressure. When we talk about the feather falling
Okay.
towards the ground, for example, one of the conditions would be air pressure. There might be winds that would govern the fall of that feather at a certain rate and chaotic pattern towards the center of the earth. What happens to when it hits the ground. So you want to look at the environment, the physical conditions, and make sure they're reasonable for permitting these physical laws to
These physical mechanisms to
physical
actually...
mechanisms to actually produce the outcome that we see.
Okay.
The third thing is that you want to ensure that these physical mechanisms that you're proposing under the observed physical conditions are capable of producing the results that you need.
Okay.
In other words, how many results are taking place per unit time.
Okay.
Obviously, this is critical to the creation evolution thing. We're seeing this many species arising with respect to time. We're proposing that these new species get here through mutations and natural selection.
This is the Darwinist explanation for
The
it.
Darwinist explanation would be, well, the physical mechanisms would be mutations and natural selection. The physical conditions, well, we got the planet Earth, lots of water, a certain temperature, air pressure, a certain amount of time, and the question is, all right, given these physical conditions, given the mechanisms that you say are responsible, can you get the speciation rate that we observe here on planet
Okay.
Earth?
So does the mechanism match the observed things that are actually happening? Okay.
Well, like the fossil record testifies to the appearance of a minimum of one new species coming into existence per year on the average.
Okay.
Then the question would be... throughout the last several billion years,
Right.
this is the rate that we've been observing, at least through the last half-billion years.
Okay.
And then an obvious question to ask, well, can mutations and natural selection really produce that much?
Okay.
I would agree that we have some evidence that mutations and natural selection can produce a few plant species, for example, under natural conditions.
Okay.
But is it going to produce everything we see in the fossil record and produce it fast enough? This is where I'd say
We've run
the
into
Darwinian evolution is failing. It can't produce that.
Right. I think just a few shows ago we talked about Neanderthals and the latest scientific discoveries that show that they are unrelated to us and unrelated to any other species. And where do they come from? And it was such a short period of time. They just emerged and then went extinct. And there's no relationship to any other species, any other mammalian species, and certainly not us.
Yeah, in the case of Neanderthal, you cannot produce the observed changes fast enough through the natural mechanisms.
Right. So something else is going on.
So something non-natural or
Okay.
supernatural must be responsible for what we're observing.
Okay.
The fourth thing would be, do you have real-time verification?
What do you mean by real-time verification?
Well, what I hear constantly from evolutionists is this idea, well, yeah, we all agree there isn't real-time verification. We're not seeing these species come into existence under direct observation.
Of human beings.
Yeah, like,
Right.
for example, a biologist going out in the field and observing several species and observing them long enough where they would be changing into different species.
Okay.
Now, the response of evolution is, well, we haven't been looking long enough. The reason why we haven't seen a pig evolve into a horse is we haven't had biologists on the field long enough to observe that whole process taking place.
Okay.
But the response is, well, we have had biologists on the field long enough that they should be able to see something,
Something should be
given
happening.
that this process is going on. I mean, let's just look over the last 3.5 billion years and figure out what we should be able to observe in the course of 100 years. And are we seeing that in the course of 100 years? So in this sense, creation, evolution, theories, and hypotheses are very testable. Let's do some real-time observations and see if we can verify that what we're suggesting is responsible is really going on.
Well, you've mentioned the four conditions. Can you give any examples of conditions or things that we see evolving through natural processes that meet these four conditions?
Definitely.
Okay.
A couple, well, probably the simplest one I could appeal to would be star formation.
Simplest to you, that is, an astronomer.
Simplest to me as an astronomer.
Okay.
All you need are 4 equations and
And you're set, huh?
it's a little bit of hydrogen and helium gas, and you can figure it all out. It's not that simple. I mean, this book, for example, has been written on this theme, and you know, it's something that takes a graduate education to really follow through in some detail.
Okay.
On the other hand, those with the graduate background in physics, once they work through it, are amazed at just how simple it is,
Okay.
and how perfectly it matches these 4 requirements.
Okay.
We have the mechanisms, basically gravitational collapse and you know, radiative dispersion of energy, how these 2 processes are in balance, and explain why stars are stable for most of the burning phase. Very simple physics, just the gas laws and gravity. It's all you really need to figure out the physics of the star. Not just the physics of the star, but how the star changes. I mean, one of the remarkable achievements of the latter part of the 20th century is that astronomers have been able to determine mechanisms that are responsible for how stars change throughout their lifespan. And we can measure the physical conditions under which this is operating. And we can predict from our equations what kinds of results we should see.
And we do get real-time observations, too, because we can go look to other places in the
Right.
sky and see that
The
happening.
theory predicts what we should see in real time. And then the astronomers go out to observe these stars, and they're behaving exactly as the theory explaining the evolution of stars would predict. All under these well-understood natural processes, and to an amazing degree of precision. And it's really, you know, fostered our understanding of stars tremendously just to work this through. It's a case where, you know, the theory perfectly predicted what the observations later demonstrated was really going on. And we can see the whole process working from one end to the other. Not that we can pick up a star that burns over a scale of 10 billion years and observe it from one end to the other.
We can't. That's not
We
possible.
can't do that.
Yeah.
But the universe contains 10 billion trillion stars. And so what we are able to do is observe several billion different stars over a window of time, let's say 100 or 200 years. And because we've got so many billions of them that we're observing, we can overlap those 100 or 200 year windows and actually observe the full range of change in a star from its birth to its death.
Okay.
Or actually, a more appropriate term is it's really star burning.
Star burning. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, astronomers talk about stellar evolution, but it's really stellar burning.
Okay.
And rather than talk about the birth of a star, I should say the ignition of a star.
Right, because that's exactly what happens, like a fusion bomb, isn't it?
It's like lighting a match.
Okay.
Okay. And after you wait a little while, the match burns out.
So something happens during the course of that time that's burning.
Maybe that's a good analogy, just giving it to me, that
Yeah.
the life cycle of a star is like the life cycle of a match. You scratch it, it ignites, it burns for a few seconds, and then it goes extinct.
Right.
Well, stars do that only over longer periods of time. Another mechanism that I think is more familiar to the layman would be raindrop formation.
Okay.
You know, raindrops have a life cycle. They form in the clouds, they get heavy, gravity causes them to fall towards the earth. When they hit the surface of the earth, they end their life. They go
Right.
splat,
Right.
end of raindrop.
And we have plenty of those to observe to do a lot of real-time
Sure.
verification on that.
And actually, raindrop physics and evolution is a whole lot more complex than star physics and star evolution.
Kidding, because I've looked at
Much
that
more
text and
complex.
it's just full of equations, and yet, and that's just for stellar burning.
Right.
And you say it's more complex for a raindrop formation.
Well, with raindrops, we can't even form all the equations.
Is that right?
With the stars, we can lay out all the equations for you, and they're linear equations. So it's very easy to predict what will happen. In fact, we can take a star like our sun and tell you exactly what it's going to do in the next few million years, billion years, all the way up through to, say, 5 or 6 billion years from now. We can tell you what the sun was like billions of years ago in the past. You know, differential equations are
Right.
They're
Powerful
magic.
tools, magical tools. That's
Yeah.
our calculus, differential equations.
Right. That lets you to predict forward and future, and you can verify it all.
Okay.
It's verifiable.
Right.
When we get into the origin of life, or how life has progressed here on planet Earth,
Right.
we see that it violates all four of these conditions.
All four of those conditions.
The mechanisms are not adequate to produce the observed changes.
Well, I think that's something that one of our previous guests had mentioned, David Berlinski. He talked about how there's no tool within the theories of Darwinian evolution to explain how it might even come about.
Right.
So there's no mechanism. Is that true?
Well, I'd say, if you haven't got a mechanism, then you've got a fatal flaw.
Right.
No mechanism, then you've got nothing.
Yeah. Okay.
And, in terms of natural process evolution, 3 mechanisms have been proposed: chaos theory, mutations, natural selection, but none of them are adequate.
Okay.
They can produce tiny changes,
Right.
but not the observed macro changes that we're seeing.
Okay. The
in
new
the fossil
species
record.
being created over
The
time.
degree of speciation we see taking place.
Right.
And so we lack the mechanisms. The physical conditions are not adequate to allow those mechanisms to produce anything significant.
Well,
The predicted results are totally inadequate.
Okay.
And there's no real-time verification.
right.
That's a strong statement. There is some real-time verification. We did a show last time we were here called Oopsie Daisy, where we talked about these Canadian daisies
Right.
that change under real-time observations. But at the end of the experiment done by the biologists, the daisies were still daisies.
They were not something else.
So in that case, we do have real-time verification of microevolutionary processes, significant changes within a species. And because the definition of the species is so ambiguous,
We're not certain if that's really a substantial change in any sense of the word, is it?
well, people have claimed that they've seen new species arise under natural conditions. But in terms of something that's dramatically different from what existed before, that's never been observed.
Okay.
I mean, the plant kingdom, the species are a whole lot closer together, morphologically and chemically speaking, than they are in the animal kingdom. So yeah, we are seeing a few plant species arising, but again, nothing dramatic.
Right.
Our own species is a good example of where we observe dramatic changes, but we're still human beings.
Exactly.
We're taller, we have better eyesight than the people alive at the times of Julius Caesar. Dramatic changes in just 2,000 years.
But no...
highly advanced small population species,
Right.
but nothing substantially has happened that would define us as anything other than human beings.
And nothing like the Star Trekian kind of fantasies of, future human beings with the large lobes and heads and all that kind of strange stuff. That hasn't happened, or nothing even approaching
Well, I'm
that.
not a fan of Star Trek, but the thing that impressed me by the few episodes I've had a chance to watch a portion of is these extraterrestrial beings that they hypothesize are not that different from us.
That's an interesting point. That's true. That's true. It's
Yeah.
hard to imagine something entirely different from us that even can remotely connect to it. But
Yeah,
anyway,
they always seem to have 2 eyes. and
two eyes and a nose.
They are
and-
able to communicate like we do,
Sure,
and
sure.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but I think the last one is one of the easiest ways to critique different interpretations on creation evolution is let's look at real-time verification, and particularly extinctions and speciation.
Now, extinctions is something that I think is important because we do see extinctions going on, do we not? A lot of them?
Significant extinction is going on and has always gone on.
Okay.
I think at the end of the 20th century, we get this idea that all the extinctions are by man's abuse of the environment.
Right. Well, that's certainly a popular view these days. And some of it's true, isn't it?
Well, I think a large amount of it is true. I mean, we have certainly, by abusing an environment, have greatly enhanced the extinction rate of species of life on this planet. But to conclude that we're responsible for all of it, I think is nonsense. I mean, species of life go extinct without us being involved at all, and always have. The fossil record testifies to massive extinction going on throughout the whole period of life here on planet Earth. But at the same time, the fossil record also testifies of speciation. Life goes extinct, life is replaced with new species.
Right.
And it's been in balance roughly throughout the last 500 million years. That we've had millions of species on the face of the Earth, and in spite of huge extinctions going on all the time, we still have millions of species on the face of the Earth. In fact, the fossil record testifies to about 1 new species showing up every year and about 1 going extinct every year. It's kind of a long-term average.
That's up until fairly recent. Now in human history, we haven't seen that, have we?
Well, we continue to see the extinctions in human history, but we do not see the speciation. And that's why we have argued in previous episodes, we cannot interpret biology today under the same paradigm or worldview that we interpret it before God created Adam and Eve.
And that goes back to the 6 days of creation. God was active for those 6-day periods, but at the seventh day, He's been in the seventh day ever since the creation of Adam
Well,
and Eve.
even if you've never read the Bible and exposed to the Christian faith and were well steeped in historical biology, you would notice that. Lots of speciation before human beings, since human beings, very little, if any, speciation going on. The Ehrlichs, for example, in their book on extinctions, made the point that we have yet to document the appearance of a single animal species in the world of nature, and the vast majority of cases we can't even see significant change in the genetic material. It may be going on, but if it's going on, it's at an extremely low level. Whereas in the past, we were seeing significant and frequent speciation. But I would argue that the Bible gives us a correct interpretation of what's taking place. Before human beings, before Adam and Eve, God was actively replacing the species of life that went extinct. Today, He's not doing that. God is resting from His work of creating new species of life. So all we see today are natural processes going on, and they don't seem to be revealing very much happening.
That's right. There's no new speciation. Very little, if any.
There's a little, but it's at a very low level compared to what we see in the past.
Right.
And what we would see before the creation of human beings would be a combination of a lot of divine activity and a tiny amount of natural process. What we see today is no divine activity and the same tiny amount of natural process. We're in that seventh day of creation. God is at rest. An eighth day is coming when God will create again. That really explains why biology in terms of speciation and extinction is different today than it was in the past.
Okay.
So this would be an example where we can take different interpretations of creation and evolution and use these four tests. Do you have reasonable mechanisms? Do the mechanisms work under the conditions that we actually observe? Are they able to produce adequate changes? And is all this verified by real-time observations? In this situation, we see that Christianity comes out winning on all four counts. That interpretation is able to pass these four tests.
Okay. Okay.
Whereas, say, if you appeal to chaos theory or punctuated equilibria of Gould and Niles Eldredge,
Right.
Rapid Darwinian processes, basically, or the traditional gradualist model,
None of these really show anything in real time, do they?
those three, which are really the three naturalist interpretations of explaining life here on planet Earth, they fail all four tests.
Okay.
Whereas the idea of God, a creator, making these laws of physics and then interrupting to specially create these species of life with respect to time, allowing the natural processes to continue as He created them, this passes all four tests.
Okay, very good.
So,
Well, let me just throw out another question here because it kind of relates. There's recent discussion going on because of the discovery in, I guess it was in Great Britain, the cloning of sheep. Do you want to bring that up here?
yeah, we could.
Because I think that's interesting. I mean, a lot of Christians are kind of curious about this, and non-Christians as well.
This is probably the 203rd question we should add to our list is, what about cloning?
Yeah, is that a creation of a new life?
Well, I think why it gets people disturbed, what they want to know, is that it seems to be indicating that we human beings can create life. And should we be creating life? And why is God permitting us to create life? Is this something we shouldn't do? And so it's raising up a lot of ethical questions, but a lot of theological issues as well.
Absolutely.
Is cloning a threat to the Christian faith?
Right.
What's taking place here? And I would argue it's like the invention of the knife.
It's a new tool.
It's a new tool that we have discovered. A tool that has a potential for evil and a tool that has a potential for great good.
Okay.
And so I can give you some examples where cloning has some very beneficial possibilities. But perhaps what I need to do is step back a minute and say, I think what's causing people to ask theological questions is cloning taking the place of God? And I would say no. All cloning is duplicating a body. A good example would be identical twins.
Okay.
I mean, if you had an identical twin, that twin would have a copy of your body, but would not possess a copy of your spirit or your soul. Only a copy of your body.
They may have a lot of similar characteristics, and physically they may have a lot of similar characteristics,
Right.
but spiritual and soulish they will not have.
Well, for example, if we took a cell off of your body and cloned an individual, that individual would not be a recreation of Mark Clark. We'd simply be making Mark Clark's identical twin. And what the Bible tells us is that we human beings have been given the right, the authority, to produce the bodies. But God's the one who instills the soul and the spirit. So when a man and a woman get together, they have a child, they're coming together sexually, produce this physical body. But at the moment of conception, God creates the spirit and the soul that will possess that body. An example I've used in our newsletter article on cloning is that it's kind of like going to a car rental agency. And you get a car. And that car has the ability to express your personality. But that car doesn't do anything unless you're behind the wheel.
Okay, so the personality that is you, is the individual
Right.
that's in it. It's like the soul.
You're the one controlling that car.
And the souls and the spirit that's in the individual is controlling that car, that physical mechanism.
Right.
Okay.
And you know what the Christian faith tells us is that one of these days the car that God gave you is going to wear out, and you're going to have to leave that thing behind. Kind of like when you bring a car back to the rental agency and say, "Hey, this car's toast. I totaled it." And after you pay them a whole lot of money, they might give you another car to rent, or they might not.
They might not, given our track record, right?
So, but it's just something. So the bodies that we have are simply rented. We don't get to keep these bodies. One of these days we have to dispense them. We're also told one of these days we're going to get a new body. A new body that will not be corruptible or perishable. And so our soul and spirit will be able to do certain things through the use of this new body. So it's simply a tool. But I was going to get back to some good and bad uses on this.
Sure. What is that?
A good use, you know, we could say take a pig or a cow or whatever and clone it and develop some desired genetic characteristics in the clone that we choose to go after. That would allow us to produce certain drugs that could be helpful for curing human diseases or develop organs that we could use for transplant. But I would say an abuse would be to say, well, you know, you've got some good organs, Mark. What we're going to do is clone you.
And then take those organs.
And we're going to take those organs out of your clone.
This is where the question of evil and the unethical use of these new tools.
Right, because that clone isn't just a piece of tissue or a body. It's got a soul and a spirit in it that God created and placed in that creature. Or obviously a master race that's been suggested too. That'd be another example.
Sure,
and that want to do.
And something like that's already happened, kind of in this century. We've had serious problems with these kinds of things. So,
but cloning is a good example where I think some proper scientific and spiritual understanding of what's going on really helps remove people's fears and allows them to make proper, intelligent use of this tool for good. So, thank you.